Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to offer a gentle reminder that what you're about to hear involves real people, real victims, and real families whose lives were forever changed by the events I'll describe. This is not entertainment. This is remembrance. This is awareness. This is a story that deserves to be told with respect and care, honoring those who suffered and those who survived. If you're settling in for the night, perhaps lower your volume just a little. Dim the lights. Let your breathing slow. We have a long journey ahead, and I'll be here with you every step of the way. Now, take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. And let me tell you about a man who wore many faces, carried many names, and left behind a trail of darkness that America had never seen before. On the morning of May 7th, 1896, in the gray stone walls of Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, a man stood on a scaffold with a noose around his neck. The prison yard was quiet except for the shuffling feet of witnesses and the distant sounds of the city waking up beyond the walls. The condemned man was calm, unnaturally so. He had requested that his coffin be filled with cement after his burial. 10 feet of concrete poured over his body so that no one could ever disturb his remains or study his brain for signs of the monster he had become. His name, at least the name the world knew him by, was H. Holmes. But that wasn't the name his mother had whispered when he was born. It wasn't the name written in the registry of his first school or the name his first wife had spoken on their wedding day. H. Holmes was an invention, a carefully crafted identity designed to hide the man beneath. And beneath that identity was another, and another, and another, like nesting dolls of deception, each one concealing something darker than the last. As the executioner checked the rope one final time, Holmes shifted his weight slightly. Someone in the crowd later said his eyes seemed distant, as though he were already somewhere else entirely. The sheriff asked if he had any final words. Holmes cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was measured and polite, the voice of a man who might have been accepting an award rather than facing death. "Gentlemen," he said, "I have very little to say. I wish to say that I am innocent of taking the life of the Pitzel family. That is all I have to say." It was a lie, of course, but then, lying was as natural to H. Holmes as breathing. He had lied to insurance companies and business partners, to wives and lovers, to landlords and lawyers and lawmen. He had lied to children, promising them safety and treats and reunions with their mother while leading them toward their deaths. He had built an entire building designed for murder and filled it with lies carved into architecture, secret passages that promised escape but led only to suffocation and fire. His whole life had been a cathedral of deception, and even now, with the noose tightening around his neck and eternity waiting below the scaffold, he could not stop. The trap door opened. Herman Webster Mudgett, the boy who became H. Holmes, the man who killed with a smile, dropped into darkness. His neck did not break cleanly. For 15 minutes, he strangled slowly, his body twitching and convulsing as life drained away. Some said it was fitting. Others simply looked away. But death did not answer the questions that haunted investigators, journalists, and the grieving families left behind. How many people had he really killed? The number changed depending on who was asking and when. In one confession, he claimed 2 victims. In another, 9. In his final published confession, he boasted of 27 murders, though even that number seemed more like performance than truth. Some investigators believed the real count might be closer to 200. Bodies had a way of disappearing around H. Holmes. People had a way of vanishing into the machinery of his life and never emerging again. Who was he really? What made a man capable of such calculated, persistent evil? And how did he get away with it for so long? Moving through American cities like a ghost, charming and killing and vanishing and reappearing somewhere new with a different name and a fresh smile. To understand the monster who died that May morning, we must go back to the beginning. Back to a small town in New Hampshire where a boy named Herman Mudgett first learned that intelligence without conscience could be the most dangerous weapon of all. The year was 1861, and America was tearing itself apart. The Civil War had just begun, brother fighting brother across fields that would run red with blood for 4 long years. But in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, a tiny farming community tucked into the hills, life continued in its quiet rhythms. The Mudgett family was respectable, religious, hardworking. Levi Mudgett was a farmer and postmaster, a man of standing in the community. His wife, Theodate, was a schoolteacher, educated and proper. They had children, and in May of that blood-soaked year, another son was born. They named him Herman Webster Mudgett. From the very beginning, there was something different about the boy. He was bright, unnaturally so. He could read before most children could write their names. He absorbed information like a sponge, memorizing poems and speeches, impressing teachers and neighbors with his quick mind and quicker tongue. But there was a coldness there too, something the adults around him couldn't quite name. When other children cried over a dead bird or a wounded rabbit, Herman watched with detached curiosity. When he was punished, he didn't rage or weep. He simply went quiet, his face blank, his eyes calculating. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but repeated often enough to have the weight of legend, about young Herman and the skeleton in the doctor's office. The local physician kept a full human skeleton in his practice, a teaching tool and a curiosity that both fascinated and terrified the children of Gilmanton. One day, a group of boys decided to play a cruel prank on Herman, who they found strange and off-putting. They grabbed him and dragged him to the doctor's office, forcing him into the room with the skeleton, holding the door shut while he screamed and pounded to get out. But the screaming stopped quickly. Too quickly. When the boys finally opened the door, expecting to find Herman huddled in terror, they found him standing calmly beside the skeleton, one hand resting on its shoulder as though they were old friends. "It's just bones," he told them. "There's nothing to be afraid of." Whether that story is true or not, something in Herman Mudgett's childhood planted the seeds of what he would become. Perhaps it was growing up in the shadow of war, learning early that life was cheap and death was everywhere. Perhaps it was the strict religious environment of his home, where any deviation from righteousness was met with harsh punishment, teaching him to hide his true self behind acceptable masks. Or perhaps there was simply something broken in him from the start, some essential piece of empathy and connection that never formed, leaving him capable of seeing other people not as humans with inner lives and feelings, but as objects to be used and discarded. By the age of 16, Herman Mudgett had left school and become a teacher himself. Imagine that for a moment. A 16-year-old boy, brilliant and cold and hungry for control, put in charge of younger children. He was good at it, by all accounts. He was patient and clear in his explanations, never raising his voice, never showing frustration. But he was also manipulative, identifying the weaker students and learning how to bend them to his will with a kind word here, a threat there, always calibrated perfectly to get what he wanted. At 18, he married. Her name was Clara Lovering, and she was from a respectable family in Alton, New Hampshire. She was 19, pretty, naive. She thought she saw kindness in Herman's eyes. What she actually saw was the reflection of what he wanted her to see, a mask so perfectly fitted that it would take years for it to slip. They had a son together. Herman showed no particular interest in the child. He had other ambitions now. Medicine called to him, not because he wanted to heal, but because he was fascinated by the mechanics of the human body, the architecture of flesh and bone, the precise ways things could go wrong. In 1882, he enrolled at the University of Michigan Medical School in Ann Arbor. This was where Herman Mudgett began to truly understand his power. Medical schools in the 1880s needed cadavers for teaching, and there was always a shortage of legal bodies. Students learned anatomy by dissecting corpses, and young Herman found himself spending long hours in the dissection lab, his hands inside dead flesh, learning the intimate geography of death. He was good at it. His hands were steady. His mind was sharp. He could identify every bone, every muscle, every organ without hesitation. But Herman wasn't content to simply study the dead. He began to see opportunity. Life insurance was still a relatively new industry, and the policies were large, and the verification processes were primitive. A man could take out a policy on himself or on a friend, and if that person died, the payout could be substantial. All you needed was a death certificate and a body. Herman Mudgett found a friend at medical school, or at least someone who trusted him enough to be useful. The young man's name has been lost to history, but the scheme has not. Together, they hatched a plan. The friend would take out a life insurance policy, naming Herman as the beneficiary. Then they would fake the friend's death using a cadaver from the medical school, disfiguring it enough that positive identification would be difficult, but not impossible. The insurance company would pay out. They would split the money and disappear into new lives. Except that's not what happened. The friend did take out the policy, but when the body was discovered, it wasn't a cadaver from the school. It was the friend himself, genuinely dead. The death was ruled accidental, and the insurance company paid out to Herman Mudgett without question. This was the moment. This was when Herman learned that he could kill and get away with it. That murder, if done carefully, could be not just possible but profitable. That the world was full of people who could be convinced to trust him, and that trust was the doorway to their destruction. He was 23 years old, and his education in death was just beginning. Take another slow breath now. Let your shoulders relax. We have a long way to go yet, and the darkness is only deepening. But I'm here with you, and we'll walk through it together, slowly, carefully, honoring those who couldn't walk away. After graduating from medical school in 1884, Herman Mudgett left his wife and son behind, without ceremony or explanation. Clara would not hear from him for years. She would wait, hoping he would return, believing perhaps that he had met with some accident or misfortune. She could not imagine that he had simply decided she no longer served a purpose, that he had closed that chapter of his life and moved on to the next as easily as turning a page. Herman drifted for a while, moving from town to town across the Midwest and Northeast. He worked briefly in hospitals and asylums, always leaving under suspicious circumstances. Money went missing. Patients died unexpectedly. But in the 1880s, medical credentials were easy to forge and difficult to verify. A doctor who wanted to disappear could do so without much trouble, and Herman Mudgett had become very good at disappearing. It was during this period of wandering that Herman Webster Mudgett began to die and H. Holmes began to live. The name change wasn't sudden or dramatic. He simply started introducing himself differently in different places, testing out identities like suits of clothing until he found one that fit. Holmes. It had a nice ring to it, respectable and memorable without being too distinctive. And the initials H could stand for Henry Howard or Harry Hiram or Herman Harold. It didn't matter. What mattered was that H. Holmes was not Herman Mudgett, and Herman Mudgett had begun to accumulate a past that needed to be left behind. In his new identity, Holmes was charming, not in a flashy way, but in the quiet, trustworthy manner of a country doctor or a beloved professor. He had a way of looking at people when they spoke that made them feel truly seen, truly heard. He remembered names and small details, asking after sick relatives and remembering birthdays. He was generous with compliments, but never obsequious. He was, by all appearances, a good man. The kind of man you would trust with your money, your secrets, your daughter. In 1886, Holmes found himself in Chicago. The city was growing at a staggering rate, swelling with immigrants and migrants from America's rural areas, all of them chasing opportunity in the great industrial engine of the Midwest. Chicago was building itself up from the swampy ground of Lake Michigan, raising streets and constructing buildings at a pace that seemed almost magical. It was crowded and chaotic and anonymous, a place where a man could be anyone and no one would ask too many questions. Holmes took a job as a pharmacist in a drugstore in Englewood, a developing neighborhood on the south side. The store was owned by a Mrs. Holton, an elderly widow whose husband had recently died. She was struggling to manage the business alone, and Holmes presented himself as the answer to her prayers. He was knowledgeable about medicines, friendly with customers, and willing to work long hours for reasonable pay. Mrs. Holton was grateful. She began to rely on him, trusting him with keys and accounts and eventually with the running of the entire operation. Within months, Holmes made Mrs. Holton an offer. He would buy the drugstore from her, paying in installments over time. She could retire comfortably, perhaps move to California to be near her daughter. Mrs. Holton agreed. It seemed like a blessing, a way out of the exhausting work that had consumed her life since her husband's death. She disappeared shortly after signing over the deed. When customers asked about her, Holmes explained that she had indeed moved to California. When her daughter wrote asking why her mother hadn't arrived, Holmes wrote back explaining that Mrs. Holton had decided to travel through the Southwest first, taking the scenic route. The letters stopped eventually. Mrs. Holton was never seen again, and Holmes never made a single payment on the drugstore. He owned it free and clear, and the woman who had sold it to him had vanished into the great American landscape as though she had never existed at all. This became the pattern: trust, transaction, disappearance. Holmes had found his rhythm, and Chicago was the perfect stage. The city was full of young women coming from farms and small towns, looking for work and independence. They arrived at train stations with cardboard suitcases and addresses of rooming houses copied carefully onto scraps of paper. They were brave and hopeful and desperately vulnerable. Holmes hired many of them to work in the drugstore. He was a kind employer, understanding when they needed to leave early or take a day off. He helped them find rooms nearby, sometimes even offering to pay their first month's rent. They were grateful. They trusted him. And when they disappeared, their families back home often didn't even know where to start looking. Chicago was so big. Accidents happened. Young women met unsuitable men and ran off. Or they got sick. Or they simply decided to move on to somewhere else, San Francisco or New York or back home, too ashamed of their failure to write. But Holmes wasn't content with small-scale operations anymore. His mind was working on something larger, something grander. He owned a corner lot across from the drugstore, and in 1887, he announced plans to build a 3-story mixed-use building. The ground floor would house retail shops and his relocated pharmacy. The upper floors would be divided into apartments and offices, rentable space for the neighborhood's growing population. It was a sensible business venture for a rising neighborhood, and no one thought to question it. Except the building that rose on that corner lot was not sensible at all. It was a maze, a puzzle box, a trap disguised as brick and mortar. And Holmes was its architect, though he hired and fired so many different contractors during construction that no single person ever saw the complete plans. In 1889, Holmes met a man named Benjamin Pitzel. Pitzel was a carpenter, a craftsman with steady hands, and a drinking problem. He had a wife, Carrie, and children, 3 daughters and 2 sons who depended on his wages. He was honest in his work, but weak in his character, the kind of man who could be dominated by someone with a stronger will. Holmes recognized this immediately. He hired Pitzel to work on his building project, and then he began the slow process of binding Pitzel to him with debts and favors and promises of future wealth. Benjamin, Holmes would say, his hand on Pitzel's shoulder, his voice warm with false friendship. You're too talented to be swinging a hammer for pennies. You and I, we're going to make something of ourselves. Real money, the kind that sets a family up for life. But I need someone I can trust. Someone loyal. Pitzel wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that someone saw potential in him, that his life could be more than paycheck to paycheck, that his children wouldn't grow up struggling the way he had. So he listened when Holmes explained his various schemes. Insurance fraud, mostly. Taking out policies and then staging accidents, collecting the money and disappearing before anyone could ask too many questions. It was dishonest, yes, but it wasn't really hurting anyone, was it? The insurance companies had plenty of money. They expected a certain amount of fraud. This was just evening the odds a little. What Pitzel didn't understand was that he wasn't Holmes's partner. He was Holmes's tool, being shaped and sharpened for a specific purpose that would become clear only when it was too late to escape. By 1890, the building was complete. 3 stories tall, taking up an entire city block, with storefronts facing the street and a complex warren of rooms and passages inside. Holmes moved his pharmacy to the ground floor and began renting out the upper spaces. He advertised for tenants, particularly young single women, secretaries and shop girls and school teachers, women who could afford the modest rent and who had no family in the city to notice if they suddenly stopped writing letters home. The building looked normal from the outside, respectable, even elegant in the ornate style of the time. But inside, it was something else entirely. Holmes had designed it himself, incorporating features that served no legitimate architectural purpose but would prove devastatingly effective for his true intentions. There were doors that opened onto brick walls, staircases that led nowhere, ending abruptly at blank ceilings. Rooms with no windows and no ventilation, sealed so tightly that sound could not escape. There were hidden passageways between walls, accessible only through concealed panels, allowing someone to move through the building unseen. There were chutes built into the walls, supposedly for laundry, but angled steeply enough that a body could slide from the upper floors down to the basement. There were grease slides and trapdoors and rooms that could be locked from the outside, but not opened from within. The basement was the most horrifying space of all. Holmes had installed a massive furnace there, large enough to burn enormous amounts of fuel and generate intense heat. There was a dissection table, stained dark despite repeated scrubbings. There were acid pits lined with brick, where flesh could be dissolved away from bone. There were shelves holding jars and instruments, surgical tools and restraints. And there was a massive iron safe, tall enough to stand in, lined with thick insulation and fitted with a complex lock that could only be opened from the outside. Holmes called this safe his vault. He told tenants that it was for storing valuables and important documents. In truth, it was a death chamber. The insulation wasn't for protecting valuables from fire. It was for soundproofing, for ensuring that screams could not be heard. And the lock wasn't for keeping thieves out. It was for keeping victims in. He would tell young women that he needed to show them something in the vault, some precious heirloom or important paper. He would open the heavy door and gesture them inside. And then, before they could react, he would slam the door shut and turn the lock. Inside, they would pound on the walls and scream until their voices gave out. They would claw at the door until their fingers bled. Holmes would sometimes sit in a chair nearby, reading a book or working on correspondence, listening to the sounds gradually weaken and fade. Sometimes he piped gas into the vault, hastening the process. Other times he simply waited, letting suffocation take its slow course. When silence finally came, he would wait longer still, ensuring death was complete. Then he would open the vault, drag the body to the dissection table, and begin his work. He was methodical and skilled, his medical training serving him well. He would strip away clothing and burn it in the furnace. He would dissect the body carefully, removing organs and studying them, sometimes preserving them in jars for later examination. He would strip flesh from bone with acid or simply by boiling the bones clean. And when he was finished, he would have a complete skeleton, articulated and mounted, ready to sell to medical schools that asked no questions about provenance and paid good money for quality specimens. People died in that building. So many people. Young women who came looking for work and found only death. Business associates who had outlived their usefulness. Creditors who asked too many questions about unpaid debts. They all went into the building, and they never came out. At least not in one piece. Not recognizable as human. Not alive. The building that would later be known as Holmes's murder castle operated for years in plain sight, camouflaged by the ordinary chaos of Chicago life. Tenants came and went, or appeared to go, their rooms cleaned and re-rented within days of their disappearance. The turnover seemed natural enough in a transient neighborhood full of people chasing opportunities and fleeing failures. No one thought to connect the dots between the cheerful young woman who worked at the pharmacy one week and the empty apartment the next. Chicago was like that. People arrived and departed like waves on the shore, and the city simply absorbed their presence and absence without comment. Holmes had married again by this time, though he had never divorced Clara. His new wife's name was Myrta Belknap, and she was everything Clara had been when they married, young and trusting and eager to believe in the future Holmes described. He met her in 1887, courted her with flowers and poetry, and married her in a quiet ceremony that January. She moved into an apartment in Wilmette, a suburb north of Chicago, far enough from Englewood that she never had reason to visit the building where her husband conducted his real business. Myrta knew Holmes as a successful businessman, a pharmacist and property owner who worked long hours but always came home with small gifts and gentle words. She bore him a daughter, Lucy, in 1889. Holmes was attentive in his fashion, providing money for the household and visiting regularly, playing the role of husband and father with the same careful attention he brought to every performance. But Myrta never saw the basement. She never walked the secret passages or heard the sounds that sometimes echoed through the building late at night. She lived in the story Holmes told her, never suspecting that she was married to a character, not a man. And still Holmes wasn't satisfied with just 2 wives. In 1894, he would marry yet again, this time to a young woman named Georgiana Yoke, who knew him as Harry Gordon. Georgiana was sweet and sheltered, the daughter of a respectable family in Franklin, Indiana. She fell completely under Holmes's spell, believing herself the luckiest woman in the world to have captured the heart of such a charming and successful man. Holmes kept her isolated from his other lives, installing her in hotels and boarding houses, always with an excuse for why they couldn't settle down just yet. Business, he would say. Important deals that required his attention. Soon, my darling. Soon we'll have our own home, and you'll want for nothing. 3 wives, none of them aware of the others. It was a juggling act that would have exhausted most men, but Holmes seemed to thrive on the complexity. Each woman represented a different role, a different story he was telling about himself. Clara was the abandoned past he never quite severed. Murdo was the respectable present, proof of his legitimacy and stability. Georgiana was the romantic future, the promise of happiness always just out of reach. And none of them knew that the man they loved didn't really exist at all. The drugstore continued to thrive. Holmes was genuinely skilled at pharmaceutical work, and he had a gift for making customers feel cared for. He would spend extra time with elderly patients, explaining their medications slowly and clearly. He would extend credit to families struggling to pay for their children's medicine. He sponsored local youth organizations and donated to church fundraisers. People in the neighborhood spoke well of him. Dr. Holmes, they called him, though he never corrected them about his credentials. He was a pillar of the community, a self-made man who embodied American success. But behind the respectable facade, the killing continued. Holmes had refined his methods, learning from each victim what worked and what didn't. He had discovered that chloroform was particularly useful, rendering people unconscious quickly and quietly. He could approach a woman in one of his upper-floor apartments, a cloth soaked in chloroform held behind his back, and before she could scream or struggle, she would crumple to the floor. Then he could take his time, moving her to the vault or one of the sealed rooms, positioning her exactly as he wanted. Some victims he gassed to death, piping coal gas or other toxic fumes into sealed chambers. He had installed gas lines throughout the building, ostensibly for lighting and heating, but with valves accessible from the passages between walls. He could flood a room with gas while standing safely outside, watching through a peephole as his victims slowly succumbed to poisoning. It was clinical, almost scientific. He would sometimes take notes, documenting how long it took, what symptoms appeared, how the body responded. Other victims he burned alive, though this was rarer. The screaming was difficult to contain, and even in the soundproof chambers, the sheer terror of burning generated sounds that Holmes worried might escape the building. But sometimes the fury of fire satisfied something in him that poison and suffocation could not. He would lock someone in a small chamber and light the gas jets, watching through the peephole as flames filled the space. Afterward, the cleanup was easier. Bones could be collected from the ashes, and flesh was already destroyed, requiring no additional processing. The skeletons Holmes sold to medical schools were of exceptional quality. He took pride in his work, carefully articulating each joint, mounting the bones with fine wire, labeling everything according to proper anatomical terminology. The schools paid well for such specimens, $200 or more for a complete skeleton, and Holmes had a steady supply of material. He told the school administrators that he worked with a network of grave robbers who procured bodies from potter's fields and unclaimed corpses from hospitals. This was common enough at the time that no one investigated too closely. Medicine needed bodies, and morality was flexible when education was at stake. Among the victims whose names we know was Emmeline Sigrand, a beautiful young woman who came to work as Holmes's stenographer in 1892. She was 24 years old, bright and capable, engaged to be married. Holmes seduced her slowly, convincing her that her fiancé was unworthy of her, that she deserved better. He wrote her love letters filled with poetry and promises. He bought her gifts. He made her feel special and seen. When her fiancé began to suspect something was wrong and demanded she return home, Holmes convinced Emmeline that she should break off the engagement. She did. She gave up her future, her family, her safety, all for a man who was already planning how her skeleton would look mounted in a medical school hallway. Emmeline disappeared in December 1892. Her family received a letter supposedly written by her, explaining that she had married and moved to Europe. The handwriting was perfect, indistinguishable from Emmeline's own careful script. Holmes had practiced for hours, studying the loops and curves of her letters, perfecting the forgery until even her sister couldn't tell the difference. The family mourned the loss of contact but assumed Emmeline was happy in her new life. They had no idea that her bones were being shipped to a medical school in St. Louis, where students would study her pelvis to learn the differences between male and female skeletal structure. Julia Connor was another victim, along with her 8-year-old daughter Pearl. Julia was the wife of a jewelry store owner who rented space in Holmes's building. She was unhappy in her marriage, and Holmes exploited that unhappiness with practiced ease. He was sympathetic when she complained about her husband's temper. He was understanding when she expressed frustration with her limited life. He made her feel beautiful and desired and worthy of better things. Julia left her husband for Holmes, bringing little Pearl with her. The three of them seemed like a happy family for a while, or at least that's what people saw. Julia worked in the pharmacy. Pearl played in the aisles between shelves of medicines and cosmetics. Holmes was gentle with the child, buying her candy and telling her stories. Julia believed she had finally found the love and security she deserved. On Christmas Eve 1891, Julia and Pearl disappeared. Holmes told inquiring neighbors that Julia's husband had returned, begging for reconciliation, and that she had decided to give the marriage another try. He seemed sad about it, as though he had lost something precious but was being noble about the loss. People sympathized with him. Poor Dr. Holmes, losing the woman he loved to her obligation to preserve a family. Julia's husband knew nothing about any reconciliation. He had given up on his wife months before and moved on with his life. When he heard the story Holmes was spreading, he went to the police, demanding they investigate. But Julia was a grown woman who had left voluntarily before. There was no evidence of foul play. The police filed a report and did nothing else. And Julia and Pearl Connor's bones ended up dissolved in acid in Holmes's basement. Every trace of them erased except for a few items of clothing that Holmes burned in his furnace one cold January night. Minnie Williams arrived in Holmes's life in 1893, and she brought with her something Holmes had never encountered before: genuine wealth. Minnie came from a prosperous family in Fort Worth, Texas. She owned property there, valuable land that generated substantial income. She was educated and independent, traveling alone to Chicago to see the world's Columbian Exposition that had transformed the city into a showcase of American innovation and optimism. Holmes met her at the fair, though the exact circumstances of their first conversation have been lost to time. Perhaps he bumped into her near one of the grand exhibition halls, apologizing profusely and offering to buy her a lemonade to make up for his clumsiness. Perhaps he struck up a conversation while they both admired the same exhibit, finding common ground in their appreciation for progress and modernity. However it happened, Holmes recognized immediately that Minnie Williams was different from his usual victims. She had resources and connections. She couldn't simply disappear without extensive investigation. So Holmes took his time. He courted Minnie over months, winning her trust and then her love. He convinced her to transfer her Texas properties to him, explaining that he could manage them more effectively, that his business acumen would multiply her wealth. Minnie, besotted and trusting, signed the necessary documents. Holmes now controlled assets worth tens of thousands of dollars. But Minnie had a sister, Nettie, and Nettie was skeptical of Holmes from the beginning. She could see through his charm to the calculation beneath. She warned Minnie to be careful, to protect her interests. When Minnie refused to listen, Nettie decided to come to Chicago herself. To meet this man her sister was so infatuated with and judge for herself whether he could be trusted. Nettie Williams arrived in Chicago in the summer of 1893. Holmes greeted her warmly, playing the gracious host. He showed her around the city, took her to restaurants, treated her with impeccable courtesy. And then, one night, both Minnie and Nettie Williams vanished. Holmes told anyone who asked that the sisters had returned to Texas to handle some family business. He forged letters in Minnie's handwriting, sending them to friends and business associates, explaining that she had decided to travel for a while and would be in touch when she settled somewhere permanently. The letters stopped eventually, as they always did, and no one in Texas ever saw Minnie or Nettie Williams again. By 1893, Chicago was preparing for the world's Columbian Exposition, a massive international fair designed to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas and to showcase American achievement to the world. The fair transformed the city, bringing millions of visitors from across America and around the globe. Hotels were full. Rooming houses sprang up overnight. The streets teemed with tourists carrying cameras and guidebooks, eager to see the white city rising from the lakefront, its grand neoclassical buildings gleaming in the sun. For H. Holmes, the fair was an opportunity unlike any he had ever encountered. The flood of visitors included thousands of young women, traveling alone or in pairs, many of them from small towns and farms where they had saved for months or years to afford the trip. They arrived wide-eyed and hopeful, ready to experience the wonders of modernity. They were perfect victims, far from home, unknown in the city, unlikely to be missed quickly if they disappeared. Holmes advertised rooms for rent during the fair, offering rates lower than most hotels, but in clean, respectable accommodations. Young women responded enthusiastically to his advertisements. Here was a well-spoken pharmacist, a professional man offering safe lodging at affordable prices. Their families back home would approve. They booked rooms weeks in advance, sending deposits, writing excited letters about their upcoming adventure. Some of those young women arrived in Chicago and checked into Holmes's building. They admired the ornate woodwork and the clean linens. They chatted with the kind doctor who owned the building, who asked about their journey and their plans for seeing the fair. They locked their doors at night and fell asleep feeling grateful for their good fortune in finding such pleasant accommodations. And some of them never woke up. The exact number of fair visitors who died in Holmes's building will never be known. Bodies disappeared too efficiently. Families back home received letters explaining that their daughter had decided to extend her stay, or had met a gentleman and was considering marriage, or had found employment in the city and would write again soon with more details. By the time those families grew concerned enough to make inquiries, the trail was months cold, and Chicago's authorities had no interest in investigating missing country girls who had probably just decided to stay in the big city or move on to somewhere else. But we know some names. We know about Anna Williams, not related to Minnie and Nettie, who rented a room for 2 weeks and was never seen again after her third night. We know about Sarah Cook and her sister, who checked in together and whose luggage was later sold to a secondhand shop. We know about Evelyn Stewart, who wrote one letter home describing her beautiful room and the kind landlord, and whose subsequent letters never arrived because they were never sent. Holmes was meticulous in his deceptions. He kept careful records of which victims had family who might investigate and which were alone in the world. He forged letters in different handwritings, mailing them from different cities to create the impression of travel. He stored victims' belongings separately, waiting months before selling them to ensure no connection could be made to their disappearance. He was patient and methodical, and the chaos of the fair gave him perfect cover. The fair closed in October 1893, and the flood of visitors slowed to a trickle. Holmes had made substantial money from his various schemes during those months, both from the legitimate rental income and from selling the belongings of the dead. But he had also accumulated debts from the building's construction that were finally coming due. Contractors who had waited patiently for payment were growing insistent. Suppliers were threatening legal action. The intricate web of lies Holmes had spun to finance his murder castle was beginning to tangle. In November 1893, fire broke out in Holmes's building. It started on the 3rd floor and spread rapidly through the wooden interior structures. The fire department responded quickly, but by the time the flames were extinguished, significant damage had been done to the upper floors. Holmes filed an insurance claim, but the investigators were suspicious. The fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting arson. And Holmes's financial situation was precarious enough that insurance fraud seemed likely. The claim was denied. Worse, the investigation attracted attention Holmes did not want. Newspapers began writing about the mysterious fire at the corner building in Englewood. Former employees came forward with strange stories about the building's layout, about rooms that made no sense and passages that led nowhere. Creditors renewed their demands, smelling vulnerability. Holmes decided it was time to leave Chicago. He had extracted what he could from this city. The building was now more liability than asset, and there were other opportunities waiting, other cities where he could start fresh with new identities and new schemes. But he needed money for the transition, substantial money, enough to set himself up properly in a new location. This was when Benjamin Pittazell's true purpose became clear. Holmes had been cultivating his relationship with Pittazel for years, binding him with debts and promises, establishing complete psychological control. Pittazel drank heavily now, his will eroded by alcohol and by the constant pressure of Holmes's manipulation. He had participated in several of Holmes's insurance frauds, providing labor and cover stories, always with the promise that the big score was coming soon, the one that would set them both up for life. Now Holmes was ready to deliver on that promise, though not in the way Pitzel imagined. Holmes explained the plan carefully, making sure Pitzel understood every detail. They would take out a life insurance policy on Pitzel for $10,000, an enormous sum equivalent to several years' wages for a working man. Then they would fake Pitzel's death using a cadaver, collecting the insurance money and splitting it between them. Pitzel would take his share and disappear with his family to start over somewhere new. Holmes would take his share and do the same. It was the perfect crime, one last brilliant scheme before they parted ways. Pitzel was hesitant. He had a wife and 5 children now. The risk seemed enormous. But Holmes was persuasive, and $10,000 was a fortune Pitzel could never hope to earn honestly. He could give his children a real future. He could stop drinking and become the father they deserved. He could finally be someone his wife could be proud of. "Trust me, Benjamin," Holmes said, his hand warm and firm on Pitzel's shoulder. "I've done this a dozen times. We'll be careful. We'll be methodical. In 6 months, you'll be living in a fine house with money in the bank, and your children will have everything they need. All you have to do is exactly what I tell you." Pitzel agreed. The policy was purchased from Fidelity Mutual Life Association in September 1893, with Pitzel's wife Carrie listed as beneficiary. The amount was $10,000, payable upon Benjamin Pitzel's death. Everything was legal and properly documented. Now all they needed was the body. Except Holmes had no intention of using a substitute body. That was too risky, too complicated. There were too many things that could go wrong with a cadaver, too many ways the fraud could be detected. No, Holmes had a simpler plan. He would use Benjamin Pitzel's real body, and he would keep all $10,000 for himself. First, though, Holmes needed to tie up loose ends in Chicago. He needed to extract himself from his debts and obligations without leaving a trail that could be followed. So he did what he always did when situations became too complicated. He disappeared. In the summer of 1894, Holmes left Chicago for good, though he left behind a web of confused creditors and angry business partners. The building in Englewood was seized by various parties claiming ownership. Legal battles would drag on for years. But Holmes himself was gone, traveling east with Georgiana Yoke, whom he had married in January of that year at a ceremony in Denver. Georgiana knew nothing of Murda or Clara, nothing of the murder castle, nothing of the bones in the basement. She thought she was on a honeymoon with her new husband, Harry Gordon, a successful businessman with prospects and plans. Holmes settled them temporarily in St. Louis while he prepared for the final phase of the Pitzel scheme. He corresponded with Benjamin, sending coded messages and instructions. Everything was proceeding according to plan, he wrote. Just a little more patience, and they would both be rich men. Benjamin Pitzel believed him. Even now, after years of seeing Holmes manipulate others, Pitzel somehow believed that he was different, that his loyalty would be rewarded, that Holmes valued their friendship enough to deal honestly with him. It was this belief, this desperate hope that he mattered to someone, that would ultimately kill him. Let your breathing slow now. Let the tension ease from your shoulders. We're approaching the darkest part of this story, the moments where Holmes's evil would reach its absolute apex. But we'll go through it together, slowly and carefully, honoring the victims even as we acknowledge the horror of what was done to them. Philadelphia in September 1894 was hot and humid, the kind of oppressive late summer weather that made people irritable and exhausted. The city was in transition, modernizing rapidly but still clinging to old ways, grand buildings rising alongside shabby tenements. Benjamin Pitzel arrived in the city alone, following Holmes's instructions to the letter. He was nervous but trying to hide it, drinking more than usual to steady his nerves. Holmes had rented a small office space for Pitzel at 1316 Callowhill Street, in a neighborhood of small businesses and workshops. The office was supposed to serve as a base for a fake patent business they would operate briefly before staging Pitzel's death. Holmes had registered the business under the name B.F. Perry, another layer of deception, another identity to obscure the truth. Pitzel moved into the office and began setting up the props they would need to make the death look convincing. He was playing a role now, the role of B.F. Perry, inventor and businessman. He filled the office with mechanical parts and tools, creating the appearance of someone working on patent applications. He spoke to neighbors casually, establishing his presence. He was creating a life that would soon be extinguished, a character who would die so that Benjamin Pitzel could be reborn somewhere else with a new name and a share of $10,000. What Pitzel didn't know was that Holmes had already decided this death would be real. There would be no substitute body, no clever switch at the last moment. Holmes had decided that Pitzel was more valuable dead than alive. Dead, he could generate $10,000. Alive, he was a witness to too many crimes, a liability who knew too much and was weak enough to crack under pressure. Holmes had been planning this murder more carefully than any he had committed before. Pitzel wasn't a stranger or a transient young woman. He had a wife who would ask questions. He had children who would demand answers. The death had to appear completely natural, or at least completely accidental. The insurance company would investigate thoroughly. Everything had to be perfect. On September 2nd, 1894, Holmes came to visit Pitzel at the Callow Hill Street office. They discussed the plan one final time, Holmes explaining how they would stage the explosion that would supposedly disfigure the substitute body beyond recognition. Pitzel was anxious, asking detailed questions about timing and logistics. Holmes was patient and reassuring, answering every concern, calming every fear. At some point during that conversation, Holmes produced a bottle. It might have been whiskey, something to steady Pitzel's nerves. Or it might have been something Holmes claimed was a tonic, a medicine to help with Pitzel's trembling hands. Whatever the explanation, Pitzel drank. And within the liquid was chloroform, enough to render him unconscious quickly. Pitzel collapsed. Holmes caught him, lowering him carefully to the floor. Then he waited, watching Pitzel's breathing slow and deepen, making sure he was completely unconscious. When he was certain, Holmes went to work. He had brought a bottle of benzene with him, a flammable liquid used in various industrial processes. He splashed it across Pitzel's face and upper body, soaking his clothes and skin. Then he struck a match. The benzene ignited in a burst of flame, and Pitzel's face began to burn. Holmes watched for several minutes, ensuring the damage was sufficient to make identification difficult, but not so extensive that the body would be unrecognizable. This had to look like an accident with an explosion, a tragic mishap that any doctor would find completely plausible. When Holmes was satisfied with the burning, he smothered the flames and arranged the scene carefully. He positioned Pitzel's body near some of the mechanical equipment, making it appear as though he had been working when the accident occurred. He scattered tools and parts around the body. He created the tableau of a man who had died suddenly in an industrial mishap, nothing more. Then Holmes walked out of the office, locked the door behind him, and disappeared into the Philadelphia afternoon. He was calm and unhurried, just another businessman going about his day. No one who saw him would have suspected that he had just committed murder. For 3 days, Benjamin Pitzel's body lay in that office, decomposing in the September heat. The smell eventually attracted attention. On September 4th, a man named Eugene Smith, who had business in a neighboring office, noticed the terrible odor coming from 1316. He knocked on the door, received no answer, and eventually summoned the landlord. Together they forced the door open. The sight and smell that greeted them was overwhelming. Pitzel's body lay sprawled on the floor, his face burned and swollen, his skin already showing signs of decay. The men backed out of the office immediately, one of them running to find a police officer while the other stood guard to keep curious onlookers away. The police arrived within the hour. They examined the scene and concluded it was an accidental death, probably an explosion related to the mechanical work Perry had been doing. The burns were consistent with a flash fire. The position of the body suggested the man had been standing when the accident occurred and had fallen where he stood. There were no signs of struggle or violence beyond the burning. It was tragic but straightforward. The coroner was called. He examined the body and agreed with the police assessment. Death by accidental explosion and resulting burns, probably instantaneous or nearly so. The corpse was photographed for the record, then removed to the morgue. The office was sealed as the police tried to determine who B.F. Perry really was, and whether he had any family who should be notified. This was where Holmes's plan encountered its first complication. He had expected the body to be discovered sooner, before significant decomposition set in. The 3-day delay had made the corpse more difficult to identify, which was good from one perspective, but complicated from another. The insurance company would require positive identification by someone who knew Pitzel. Holmes needed Carrie Pitzel to see the body and confirm it was her husband, but the condition of the corpse was now worse than he had intended. Holmes sent a telegram to a man named Jephthah Howe in St. Louis, claiming to be Pitzel and requesting that Howe come to Philadelphia to help wind up some business affairs. Howe was a lawyer who had done work for Holmes before, though he didn't know about the insurance scheme. He traveled to Philadelphia as requested, expecting to handle some routine legal matters. When Howe arrived, Holmes met him and explained that there had been a terrible accident. B.F. Perry, who was actually Benjamin Pitzel working under an assumed name, had been killed in an explosion. Holmes expressed deep grief and shock, playing the devastated friend perfectly. But now there was a delicate situation. The insurance policy. It would pay out $10,000 to Carrie Pitzel, money the family desperately needed. But someone had to identify the body as Benjamin Pitzel, and Holmes couldn't do it himself because he wasn't supposed to be connected to the B.F. Perry identity. Howe was confused but sympathetic. He agreed to help. Together, they devised a plan. Carrie Pitzel would come to Philadelphia along with her daughter Alice, who was 15 years old. Alice would identify the body as her father, providing the necessary confirmation for the insurance claim. Holmes would arrange everything, guiding the family through the process while remaining officially uninvolved. Carrie Pitzel received the news by telegram. Her husband was dead, killed in an accident in Philadelphia. She was devastated but also, perhaps, not entirely surprised. Benjamin had always been involved in risky schemes, always promising that the next plan would finally pay off. She had feared something like this might happen eventually. What she didn't know was that Holmes was already spinning the next layer of his deception. The insurance money wasn't going to save the Pitzel family. It was going to finance their destruction. Carrie Pitzel and her daughter Alice arrived in Philadelphia in mid-September, their grief still raw and overwhelming. Carrie was a worn woman, aged beyond her years by poverty and worry and the constant stress of being married to a man who could never quite manage to provide stability. She had 5 children to care for: Alice, who was 15, Nellie, who was 11, Howard, who was 8, and 2 younger daughters who had been left behind with relatives. Now she was a widow, alone in a strange city, trying to navigate bureaucracy and grief, while her eldest daughter struggled to be strong for her mother's sake. Holmes met them at the train station, his face arranged in an expression of profound sympathy. He took Carrie's hands in his, looked into her eyes with what appeared to be genuine compassion, and told her how sorry he was for her loss. Benjamin had been his dear friend, he said. Such a good man, such a tragic accident. He would do everything in his power to help the family through this difficult time. Carrie was grateful. She had no one else to turn to, no resources, no understanding of how to navigate the legal and financial complexities of her husband's death. Holmes seemed like an angel sent to guide her through the darkness. He took them first to a hotel, insisting on paying for their room. Then he explained what would happen next. Alice would need to view the body and confirm that it was her father. This would be difficult, Holmes warned gently. The explosion had damaged Benjamin's face significantly, but it had to be done for the insurance claim to be processed. Alice was a brave girl, mature for her 15 years. She had helped raise her younger siblings, had watched her mother struggle, had seen her father's failures, and still loved him. She nodded when Holmes explained what she would need to do. She would be strong. She would do this for her family. The next day, Holmes took Alice to the morgue. The attendant led them to where Pitzel's body lay, now in significantly worse condition after nearly 2 weeks of decomposition. The smell was overpowering. Alice pressed a handkerchief to her nose and mouth, fighting down nausea, forcing herself to look at the corpse on the table. The face was swollen and discolored, burned and decayed beyond easy recognition. But Alice could see enough. The build of the body, the hands, the clothing. She could see enough to know this was her father, the man who had picked her up when she was small and promised her better things. "It's him," she whispered. "That's my father." Holmes put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're very brave," he told her. "Your father would be proud of how strong you're being." The identification was recorded officially. Alice Pitzel had viewed the body and confirmed it was her father, Benjamin Pitzel. The paperwork was filed with the insurance company. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the claim to be processed and the money to be paid out. But Holmes told Carrie that there was a complication. The insurance company was suspicious, as they often were with large claims. They might investigate thoroughly, might even accuse the family of fraud. It would be better, Holmes suggested, if Carrie and the children stayed out of sight for a while, moved around a bit, made themselves hard to find until the money came through and everything was settled. Carrie was confused. Why would the insurance company suspect fraud? Her husband had died in an accident. There was a body, an official death certificate, everything proper and legal. But Holmes explained patiently that insurance companies were always looking for reasons not to pay. They might investigate Benjamin's background, discover some of his past indiscretions, use that as an excuse to deny the claim. The best thing the family could do was disappear for a few weeks, let Holmes handle the insurance company, and wait for the good news. It made a kind of sense to Carrie's exhausted mind. She didn't want to deal with suspicious investigators anyway. She just wanted the money that was owed to her so she could feed her children and find a place to live. If Holmes thought it was best for them to stay mobile for a while, she would trust his judgment. What Carrie didn't know was that Holmes had already received the insurance money. The $10,000 had been paid out, and Holmes had claimed it through a series of complex arrangements involving Jephthah, Howe, and forged documents. Carrie would never see a penny of it. The money that was supposed to secure her children's future was already in Holmes's pocket, funding his plans for escape and new schemes. But Holmes wasn't done with the Pitisel family yet. He had the money, but he also had a problem. Carrie knew too much about Benjamin's connection to Holmes. The children, especially Alice, had seen Holmes frequently and could connect him to their father. As long as the Pitisels were alive, they were potential witnesses, threads that could be pulled to unravel everything. Holmes made his decision with the same cold calculation he brought to every choice. The Pitisel family would have to disappear. Not all at once, which might attract attention, but gradually, carefully, in a way that would leave no trail and raise no immediate alarms. He started by separating them. He told Carrie that it would be safer if the family split up temporarily. He would take Alice, Nellie, and Howard with him to travel while looking for a good place to settle. Carrie would take the two younger daughters and travel a different route. This way, if the insurance investigators came looking, they wouldn't find the whole family together. It was just a precaution, Holmes explained. Just being extra careful. Carrie was reluctant. She didn't want to be separated from her children. But Holmes was persuasive, and Carrie was so tired, so overwhelmed. He painted a picture of the danger they might be in if the insurance company decided to make trouble. He reminded her that she had the two youngest to care for, that traveling with all 5 children would be difficult and expensive. He promised that Alice, Nellie, and Howard would be perfectly safe with him, that he would treat them like his own children, that they would all be reunited soon. Finally, Carrie agreed. On October 9, 1894, the Pitisel family split up in Cincinnati. Carrie took her 2 youngest daughters and headed toward Indianapolis, where Holmes had arranged for a place for them to stay. Holmes took Alice, Nellie, and Howard and promised to write Carrie regularly, keeping her informed of their whereabouts and the children's well-being. Alice, Nellie, and Howard climbed into Holmes's carriage, excited despite the circumstances. They had always liked Uncle Holmes, as they called him. He was kind and told funny stories and bought them treats. Going with him felt like an adventure, a break from the sadness and stress that had filled their lives since their father's death. They had no idea that they would never see their mother again. Holmes drove them to a hotel in Cincinnati and checked in under a false name. The children shared a room, and Holmes took the room next door. That night, he sat in his room making careful notes in a ledger he carried. 3 children, ages 15, 11, and 8. He calculated the costs of traveling with them, the expenses of hotels and meals. He considered the practical challenges of disposing of 3 bodies instead of 1. He planned his route, choosing cities where he had connections, where he knew places that would serve his purposes. The next morning, Holmes woke the children early. They were going on a trip, he told them. A wonderful trip to see different cities. And along the way, they would be writing letters to their mother, letting her know they were safe and happy. He had already purchased stationery and stamps. The children thought this was exciting. Howard especially loved the idea of sending letters like a grown-up. What the children didn't know was that Holmes would read every letter before it was sent, making sure nothing they wrote revealed too much. And as the journey continued, Holmes would write more and more of the letters himself, forging the children's handwriting, creating a paper trail of false reassurance while the reality grew darker with each passing day. The group traveled to Indianapolis first, staying in a hotel near where Carrie and the younger girls were lodged, though Holmes made sure the two parts of the family never actually encountered each other. He kept the children in their room most of the time, bringing them food, telling them they needed to stay quiet and out of sight because of the insurance investigation. Alice was old enough to find this strange, but she trusted Uncle Holmes. He had been her father's friend. He was helping their family. She swallowed her doubts and helped keep her younger siblings entertained in the confining hotel room. From Indianapolis, they moved to Detroit, then to Toronto. At each stop, Holmes checked into hotels under different names, paying cash, leaving no clear trail. The children wrote letters to their mother, describing the cities they were seeing, the foods they were eating, the things Uncle Holmes was showing them. They were beginning to get anxious, asking when they would see their mother again. But Holmes always had a reason for delay. Soon, he would tell them. Very soon. Just a few more days, and everything would be settled. But everything would not be settled. Everything was spiraling toward horror, and the three Pitisel children were at the center of a nightmare they couldn't even imagine. Toronto in October 1894 was crisp and cold, autumn settling over the Canadian city with a promise of the harsh winter to come. Holmes had chosen Toronto deliberately. It was far from Philadelphia, across an international border, in a jurisdiction where American authorities would have difficulty investigating. And Holmes had rented a house there months earlier under yet another assumed name, preparing this location as one of several potential sites for what he had planned. The house was at 16 St. Vincent Street, a modest two-story dwelling in a respectable neighborhood. Holmes had furnished it sparsely, just enough to give the appearance of occupation. Most importantly, the house had a good deep cellar with a dirt floor, perfect for his purposes. Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pitisel arrived at the house with Holmes on October 25th. They were tired from traveling, homesick for their mother and younger sisters, but still trusting that Uncle Holmes knew what he was doing. The house seemed nice enough. There was a parlor with furniture and a kitchen with dishes. Holmes showed them to a bedroom upstairs where they could sleep, Alice and Nellie sharing a bed, Howard in a small cot nearby. That first night, Holmes made them a simple dinner. He was solicitous and kind, asking about their comfort, making sure they had enough blankets against the autumn chill. He told them stories before bed, the way their father used to, and when little Howard asked again when they would see their mother, Holmes smiled and said, "Very soon now. Just a few more days, and we'll all be together." Howard fell asleep easily, exhausted from travel. Nellie took longer, her 11-year-old mind churning with vague anxieties she couldn't quite name. Alice lay awake longest of all, staring at the ceiling, wondering why this all felt wrong even though she couldn't point to anything specific that was actually wrong. Uncle Holmes had been nothing but kind. They were safe and fed and warm. So why did she feel this creeping dread, this sense that something terrible was waiting just out of sight? She finally slept, and her dreams were troubled and strange. The next morning, Holmes announced that he had business to attend to in the city and would be gone most of the day. The children were to stay in the house and keep quiet. He didn't want the neighbors asking questions about who was staying there. Alice was old enough to watch her younger siblings, wasn't she? Of course she was. He left them with bread and cheese for lunch and promised to bring back something special for dinner. The children spent the day playing quiet games and looking out the windows at the unfamiliar street. Nellie found some books on a shelf and read aloud to Howard, who was getting restless from being cooped up. Alice tried to write another letter to their mother, but she found herself struggling with what to say. "Everything is fine," she wrote, then crossed it out. "We're in a house now, in a city called Toronto. Uncle Holmes says we'll see you soon. I hope you and the girls are well. We miss you very much." She sealed the letter and left it on the table for Holmes to mail. She had no way of knowing that her mother would never receive it, that Holmes would simply destroy it along with all the other evidence of the children's presence in Toronto. Holmes returned that evening with fried chicken and potatoes, a feast that delighted the hungry children. He was in good spirits, joking and telling stories, making them laugh. For a few hours, the house felt almost normal, almost like a real home with a real family. But after dinner, Holmes's demeanor changed. He became quieter, more distracted. He kept looking at Howard, the 8-year-old boy who was still young enough to trust completely, still innocent enough to see adults as protectors rather than threats. "Howard," Holmes said suddenly, "I need your help with something in the cellar. There's a trunk down there that I need to move, and I could use a strong boy to assist me." Howard was delighted to be asked. He wanted to help, wanted to prove he was useful and capable. He followed Holmes to the cellar door without hesitation, chattering about how strong he was, how he helped his father move heavy things all the time. Alice and Nellie barely noticed them leaving. They were absorbed in the book Nellie had been reading, and the cellar was just the cellar, nothing special or concerning about it. In the cellar, Holmes lit a lamp and showed Howard the trunk in question. It was indeed heavy, filled with books and tools that Holmes had placed there specifically to make the story plausible. Together, Holmes and Howard began to slide the trunk across the dirt floor, the boy straining and grunting with effort, proud to be helping. "You're doing wonderfully," Holmes told him. "Your father would be so proud of how strong you've become." Howard beamed at the praise. He loved his father, missed him terribly, and hearing Uncle Holmes say he would be proud made Howard's heart swell with happiness. They moved the trunk to the opposite wall. Howard stood back, breathing hard, wiping sweat from his forehead. Holmes patted him on the shoulder, then reached into his pocket and drew out a cloth. Before Howard could react, before he could even understand what was happening, Holmes pressed the chloroform-soaked cloth over the boy's nose and mouth. Howard struggled for perhaps 10 seconds, his small hands batting weakly at Holmes's arm, his body twisting. But he was only 8 years old, and Holmes was a full-grown man with medical knowledge and no hesitation. The chloroform did its work quickly. Howard went limp in Holmes's arms, unconscious and helpless. Holmes lowered the boy to the dirt floor and waited, making sure the unconscious state was deep and complete. Then he retrieved a length of rope he had hidden behind the furnace and wrapped it around Howard's neck. He pulled it tight, tighter, cutting off air, collapsing the windpipe. Howard's body convulsed reflexively, his brain sending desperate signals even though he was too far under to regain consciousness. Holmes held the rope firm until all movement stopped, until he was certain the boy was dead. Then he sat back on his heels and examined what he had done with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. The body would need to be disposed of completely, leaving no trace. Burning was the most effective method, but the boy was too large to fit in the house's small stove. Holmes would need to dismember the body first, a task that would take time and care. He went to work methodically, using tools he had brought to the house weeks before. He dismembered Howard Pittazell's small body in that cellar, separating limbs from torso, flesh from bone. He wrapped the pieces in oilcloth and carried them upstairs in batches, feeding them into the stove in the kitchen. The smell was terrible, thick and sweet and wrong, but Holmes opened windows and burned incense to mask it. He worked through the night, maintaining the fire at a high temperature, ensuring complete cremation. By morning, Howard Pittazell had been reduced to ash and fragments of bone. Holmes collected what remained, placed it in a bag, and later that day scattered it in different locations around Toronto, in the lake, in vacant lots, ensuring no identifiable trace would ever be found. Upstairs, Alice and Nellie woke to find Howard gone. Where was he? Where was their little brother? Holmes explained calmly that Howard had left very early that morning to go stay with their mother. It was safer that way, Holmes said. The insurance investigators were getting close, and having all 3 children together was too risky. Didn't they want Howard to be safe with their mother? Alice wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to believe that her little brother was safe, that he was with their mother and the younger girls, that everything was proceeding according to some plan she just didn't fully understand. But something in Holmes's eyes was wrong. Something in the way he wouldn't quite meet her gaze made her stomach twist with fear. "When will we see them?" Alice asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Soon," Holmes said, smiling his reassuring smile. "Very soon now." But Alice could smell something strange in the house, something that reminded her of burned meat. And Howard's few belongings, the little wooden horse he carried everywhere and the spare shirt their mother had packed for him, were still upstairs in the bedroom. Why would he leave without those things? Why would he go to their mother without even saying goodbye to his sisters? Nellie was crying, wanting her little brother, wanting her mother. Holmes comforted her with practiced ease, promising that everything was fine, that Howard was probably eating a good breakfast right now and playing with his younger sisters. This seemed to satisfy Nellie somewhat. She was only 11, still young enough to accept adult explanations even when they didn't quite make sense. But Alice was 15, old enough to know when something was wrong, old enough to feel the cold fingers of real fear closing around her heart. She said nothing, though. She didn't know what to say or who to say it to. They were in a strange city in a foreign country, alone with Uncle Holmes, and she didn't even know the address of where they were staying or how to contact her mother. She was trapped, and some deep instinct told her that showing her suspicions to Holmes would be dangerous. So she stayed quiet. She watched. She waited. And she tried to think of some way to protect herself and Nellie from whatever was coming next. For 3 days after Howard's disappearance, Alice and Nellie remained in the house on St. Vincent Street. Holmes came and went, always with plausible explanations for his absences. Business, he would say. Arrangements being made for their reunion with their mother. Everything was proceeding according to plan. They just needed to be patient a little while longer. Alice tried to write letters to their mother, but Holmes always found reasons why they couldn't be sent yet. Not safe, he would explain. The investigators might intercept them. Better to wait until they were all together and there was no more need for secrecy. Alice didn't argue, but she began hiding bits of paper, starting to keep a record of where they had been and when, some instinct telling her that documentation might become important. Nellie was withdrawing into herself, made quiet by the strangeness of their situation and the absence of her little brother. She clung to Alice at night, and Alice would hold her and hum the songs their mother used to sing. Trying to provide comfort, she didn't feel herself. Every sound in the night made Alice's heart race. Every time Holmes's footsteps came up the stairs, she tensed, waiting to see what fresh lie or new horror he might bring. On the third night, Holmes announced that they would be leaving Toronto soon, moving to another city, perhaps back to the United States. The house had served its purpose, and staying in one place too long was dangerous. They should pack their few belongings and be ready to leave at a moment's notice. Alice asked again about their mother. Where was she? When would they see her? Holmes's answer was vague and contradictory. Soon, he said. Very soon. But there were still complications with the insurance money, still investigators asking questions. They needed to stay mobile, stay invisible, just a little while longer. That night, after Holmes had gone to his own room, Alice lay awake planning. She and Nellie could try to run. They could wait until Holmes was asleep or out of the house, and they could simply walk out the door and find a police station or someone in authority who could help them get back to their mother. But every time Alice thought through this plan, she ran into obstacles. They had no money. They didn't know Toronto's streets or where to go for help. They were children, and Holmes was a respected-looking adult who would have a convincing explanation for why two young girls were trying to run away from him. Who would believe them? What would they even say? That they had a bad feeling? That their little brother had supposedly been sent to their mother, but they suspected something was wrong? Alice realized with growing horror that they were completely powerless. Holmes had engineered a situation where the girls were utterly dependent on him, isolated from anyone who might help them, stripped of resources and knowledge. Even their trust in adults, their childhood assumption that grown-ups would protect them, had become a weapon turned against them. The next morning, Holmes seemed agitated. He paced the house, checking windows, looking out at the street repeatedly. Something had made him nervous, though Alice couldn't tell what. Perhaps he had seen someone he recognized, or perhaps his paranoia was simply growing as his crimes accumulated. Whatever the reason, he announced suddenly that they were leaving immediately. No more delays. Pack everything now. Alice and Nellie gathered their few possessions. Alice made sure to keep her hidden papers with the record of their travels tucked into her dress. If they were caught, if something happened to her, maybe someone would find those papers and use them to understand what had been done to them. They left the house on St. Vincent Street that afternoon. Holmes locked the door behind them and pocketed the key. He hailed a cab and gave an address Alice didn't recognize. They drove through Toronto's streets, the two girls huddled together in the back of the cab while Holmes sat beside them, his face calm but his hands restless, fingers drumming against his knee. The cab stopped at a different house, this one on Vincent Street. It looked similar to the previous house, but perhaps slightly smaller. Holmes paid the driver and ushered the girls inside quickly, as though he didn't want them to be seen standing on the street. This house also had a cellar. Alice noticed the door immediately, noticed how Holmes's eyes went to it, noticed something dark and eager in his expression when he looked at that closed door leading down into darkness. "I need to go out for a few hours," Holmes announced once they were inside. You girls stay here and keep quiet. Don't answer the door if anyone knocks. Don't look out the windows. Just wait for me to return. Can you do that?" Alice nodded numbly. What else could she do? Nellie clung to her sister's hand, her face pale and frightened. She had stopped asking about Howard, stopped asking about their mother. She had retreated into a kind of silent resignation that broke Alice's heart. Holmes left. The girls heard his footsteps on the porch, the sound of the front door being locked from the outside. They were prisoners now, officially and undeniably. Alice went to the windows and found them painted shut, impossible to open without breaking the glass. She checked the back door and found it locked as well, secured with a heavy bolt that had been installed recently, the fresh scratches in the wood suggesting very recent installation. They were trapped, and Alice knew with terrible certainty that Holmes had no intention of ever reuniting them with their mother. Whatever had happened to Howard was going to happen to them. The only questions were when and how. She pulled Nellie close and whispered fiercely in her ear, "We're going to get out of here. I promise you. I'll find a way. We're going to get back to Mama and the girls. Just stay close to me and do exactly what I say, all right?" Nellie nodded, tears streaming down her face. She was only 11 years old, still a child, and she was terrified in a way that went beyond ordinary fear. She could feel the wrongness in the air, could sense the danger even if she couldn't articulate it. The girls explored the house carefully, looking for any possible escape route. The windows were all painted shut or nailed closed. The doors were locked from outside. The cellar door was unlocked, and Alice briefly considered whether they could hide down there, but one look at the dark stairs leading down made her reject that idea. The cellar felt wrong, felt dangerous in a way she couldn't explain. Some animal instinct told her that going down those stairs would be the worst possible choice. They ended up in a bedroom on the second floor, huddled together on a bare mattress, waiting for Holmes to return. Hours passed. Darkness fell. The house creaked and settled around them, every sound making them jump, every shadow seeming to contain threat. Finally, they heard the front door open. Holmes's footsteps came through the house, slow and measured. He climbed the stairs, and the girls could hear him coming closer, closer. Alice held Nellie tight, both of them frozen in terror. Holmes appeared in the doorway. He was carrying something, a covered dish that he set down on a small table. "I brought you girls some dinner," he said pleasantly, as though this were a normal evening in a normal household. "Eat up. You need to keep your strength up." Neither girl moved. Neither could bring herself to eat food provided by this man who had become a monster in their eyes. Holmes seemed unbothered by their refusal. He sat down in a chair near the door, blocking their only exit, and regarded them with an expression that might have been tenderness in another context. "I want you to know," he said softly, "that I've genuinely enjoyed our time together. You're both good girls, polite and well-behaved. Your mother raised you right." Alice found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Where is our mother? Where is Howard? What have you done?" Holmes smiled, and there was something terrible in that smile, something that made Alice's blood run cold. "Your mother is fine," he said. "She's with your sisters. As for Howard, well, Howard is at peace now. He didn't suffer. I made sure of that." The words didn't make sense for a moment. Alice's mind refused to process what he was actually saying. But then understanding crashed over her like a wave of ice water, and she felt Nellie stiffen in her arms as the younger girl also understood what Holmes was confessing. "You killed him," Alice whispered, her voice breaking. "You killed our brother." "It was necessary," Holmes said calmly, as though discussing the weather. "I couldn't let him go back to your mother and tell her about our travels together. He knew too much, might say the wrong thing to the wrong person. It was cleaner this way." Nellie began to scream, a high keening wail of grief and terror. Holmes stood up and moved toward them. Alice tried to shield her sister, tried to put herself between Nellie and this monster, but Holmes was too strong and too fast. He grabbed Nellie, pulling her away from Alice despite Alice's desperate clutching. Alice fought. She clawed at his face, kicked at his legs, screamed for help though she knew no one would come. Holmes struck her, a backhanded blow that sent her sprawling to the floor. Her vision swam with pain and shock. By the time she could focus again, Holmes had Nellie pinned under one arm and was pulling a cloth from his pocket. "No!" Alice screamed, lurching to her feet. "Please, no. She's just a little girl, please." But Holmes pressed the chloroform-soaked cloth over Nellie's face, and the 11-year-old's struggles weakened and ceased. Her body went limp in his arms. He lowered her to the floor, and Alice crawled toward her sister, sobbing, trying to wake her, though she knew it was already too late. Holmes grabbed Alice from behind, his arms strong and implacable. She felt the cloth press over her own face, smelled the sickly sweet chemical odor. She tried to hold her breath, tried to fight, but her lungs were already burning from screaming, and her body's reflexes overrode her will. She gasped, inhaled the chloroform, felt the world tilting and darkening. Her last conscious thought was of her mother, and how Carrie Pitzel would never know what happened to her children, would never know how they had been betrayed, how they had died terrified and alone, crying out for help that would never come. Then darkness took her, and Alice Pitzel knew nothing more. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. Alice became aware of darkness first, absolute and complete. Then cold, a deep, bone-penetrating cold that made her whole body shiver. Then smell, earth and damp, and something chemical that made her eyes water. Finally, sound, her own breathing rapid and panicked, echoing strangely in a confined space. She tried to move and discovered she couldn't. Her hands were bound behind her back, rope cutting into her wrists. Her ankles were tied as well. She was lying on hard ground, on what felt like packed dirt. And she was not alone. She could hear another person breathing nearby, the pattern irregular and frightened. "Nellie," Alice whispered into the darkness. A sob answered her, and then Nellie's voice, small and broken. "Alice? Alice, I can't see. Where are we? I want Mama." "I'm here," Alice said, trying to make her voice steady and calm even though terror was screaming through every nerve in her body. "I'm right here, Nellie. We're together. We're going to be all right." It was a lie, and somewhere deep down Alice knew it was a lie, but it was all she had to offer her little sister. Some comfort in the face of the unthinkable. They were in the cellar. Alice could tell from the smell and the quality of the darkness and the cold rising from the earth beneath her. Holmes had brought them down here while they were unconscious, tied them up, and left them in the dark. But why? Why not kill them immediately like he had killed Howard? Why this torture of binding them and leaving them alive in the darkness? Perhaps he wanted them to suffer first. Or perhaps he was simply being practical, waiting for an opportune time to complete what he had started. Either way, Alice realized they had been granted a small window of time, maybe hours, maybe less. And in that window, they had to find some way to escape, or at least to fight back. She began working at the ropes around her wrists, twisting and pulling, ignoring the pain as the rough fiber bit into her skin. The knots were tight, but not expertly tied. Holmes was many things, but not a sailor or a practiced restrainer of prisoners. There was hope, however slim, that she might be able to work herself free. "Nellie," she whispered urgently, "can you move your hands at all? Can you try to untie yourself?" She heard Nellie shifting in the darkness, heard her sister's breathing change as she began to struggle with her own bonds. The sounds of their efforts seemed terribly loud in the enclosed space. Every scrape and rustle might alert Holmes if he was anywhere nearby. But they had no choice. Staying tied up meant certain death. At least fighting gave them a chance, however small. Time passed in a strange liquid way, impossible to measure in the absolute darkness. Alice's wrists were bleeding now. She could feel the warm wetness of blood making the ropes slippery. She pulled harder, twisting her hands at agonizing angles, driven by desperation and the fierce need to protect her sister. And then, miraculously, she felt the rope give. Just a little at first, a slight loosening. She pulled harder, ignoring the screaming pain in her wrists and shoulders. The rope slipped more, and then suddenly her hands were free. She bit back a cry of triumph and immediately went to work on the ropes binding her ankles. Her fingers were numb and clumsy, and the knots were tight, but eventually she worked them loose. She was free. She crawled across the dirt floor toward where Nellie's breathing came from, her hands outstretched until they found her sister's small shaking body. "I'm going to untie you," Alice whispered. "Hold still." She worked at Nellie's bonds by touch in the darkness, her bleeding fingers leaving smears of blood on the rope, but finally managing to loosen the knots. Nellie's hands came free, then her ankles. The two girls clung to each other for a moment, crying silently into each other's shoulders. Then Alice forced herself to think. They were free of the ropes, but they were still in a locked cellar in a house controlled by a murderer. They needed to find a way out before Holmes returned, and they needed to do it in complete darkness without making noise that might alert him. Alice stood carefully, her legs weak and unsteady. She reached up, hands searching for the ceiling, and found it lower than she expected. She moved slowly in what she hoped was the direction of the stairs, hands outstretched, feeling her way through the darkness. Nellie followed, one hand clutching Alice's dress, both of them moving with agonizing slowness. Alice's hand found wood, a wall or a post. She followed it, tracing its shape, and realized it was a support beam. She continued moving, and her foot found something else, something that shifted when she stepped on it. She knelt down and felt with her hands. A shovel, and beside it, what felt like a pickaxe or some other tool. Tools. They had weapons now if it came to a fight. The thought should have been comforting, but Alice knew that two children with improvised weapons stood little chance against a grown man who had already proven he was willing and capable of killing. Still, it was better than nothing. She picked up the shovel and handed what felt like a heavy wrench to Nellie. "If he comes down here," Alice whispered, "we fight. We hit him as hard as we can and we run. Understand?" Nellie's whispered, "Yes," was barely audible, but Alice felt her sister's grip tighten on the wrench. They continued their careful exploration of the cellar, and Alice's hands finally found the stairs. She climbed them slowly, Nellie right behind her, until her head touched the cellar door. She pushed against it gently, testing, and found it locked from the outside as expected. But it was just a door. Wood and hinges and a lock. Not impossible. Not necessarily. Alice ran her hands along the edges, feeling for any weakness. The door was solid but old. The hinges were on the outside, unfortunately, but the lock plate was on the inside, screwed into the doorframe. If they had a screwdriver, they might be able to remove the lock plate and open the door from inside. But they didn't have a screwdriver. They had a shovel and a wrench in desperation. Alice descended the stairs again and whispered to Nellie to wait there. Then she made her way back to where she had found the tools, searching by touch for anything else that might be useful. Her hands closed on something small and metallic. She brought it close to her face, trying to make out its shape in the darkness, and realized it was a metal file. A file. It could work. If she could work it into the screws holding the lock plate, she might be able to loosen them enough to remove the plate and get the door open. It would take time and would make noise, but what other option did they have? She returned to the stairs and began working at the first screw, using the file as an improvised screwdriver. The metal point kept slipping from the screw head, and the angle was awkward, and her bleeding hands made everything slippery and difficult. But slowly, agonizingly, the screw began to turn. It seemed to take forever. Alice's arms ached from the awkward position, and sweat dripped into her eyes despite the cold. Nellie sat on the steps below her, occasionally reaching up to touch Alice's leg, needing that reassurance that her sister was still there. The first screw came loose. Then the second. Alice was working on the third when they heard it. Footsteps above. Holmes had returned. Both girls froze, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps moved across the floor above them, casual and unhurried. They heard a chair scrape, heard what might have been Holmes settling in to read or work. He was directly above them, and they were trapped. Alice continued working at the screw, but more slowly now, trying to minimize the sound. She got the third screw out, then started on the fourth and final one. Her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely hold the file. Sweat and blood and terror made everything slippery and uncertain. The fourth screw was stuck, corroded in place. Alice worked at it desperately, feeling it beginning to strip under the pressure. If it stripped completely, she wouldn't be able to get it out, and the lock plate would remain attached. "Please," she prayed silently. "Please, please, please." The screw turned. Just a fraction, but it turned. Alice kept working it, feeling it gradually loosen. More turns, more desperate twisting of the file. And then finally, it came free. The lock plate was held only by the screws now, the lock mechanism itself sitting loose in its housing. Alice pulled gently at the plate, and it came away from the door in her hands. The way was clear. All that remained was to push the door open and run. But Holmes was right above them. If they burst out of the cellar, he would hear immediately. He would be on them before they could get out of the house. They needed him distracted, needed him somewhere else in the building, needed just a few seconds head start. Alice handed the lock plate to Nellie and whispered the most desperate plan she had ever conceived. "When I open this door, I want you to run. Don't look back. Don't wait for me. Run straight through the house and out the front door and into the street. Scream as loud as you can. Wake the neighbors. Get help. What about you? Nellie whispered back, her voice thick with tears. I'll be right behind you, Alice lied. But you're faster than me. You run first, and I'll follow. Promise me you'll run, Nellie. Promise me you won't stop no matter what happens. Nellie was crying now, but she nodded. I promise. Alice took a deep breath and positioned herself at the door. She gripped the shovel tightly in her right hand. Then she threw her weight against the door, bursting it open and stumbling out into the kitchen. Holmes was there, standing near the table with a cup of coffee in his hand. The shock on his face would have been almost comical in any other context. He had expected to find the girls tied and helpless in the cellar, not bursting out armed and desperate. Run! Alice screamed at Nellie, and the 11-year-old bolted past her, heading for the front of the house. Holmes moved to intercept, dropping the coffee cup and lunging toward Nellie. Alice swung the shovel with every ounce of strength she possessed, connecting with Holmes's shoulder in a solid meaty thump that knocked him sideways. He staggered, but didn't fall, his face twisting with rage. Alice swung again, but Holmes caught the shovel this time, wrenching it from her hands. He shoved her backward, and she fell hard against the kitchen table. Through the doorway, she could see Nellie fumbling with the front door lock, could hear her sister sobbing as she struggled to work the unfamiliar mechanism. Open it! Alice screamed. Get out! The door opened. Nellie disappeared through it, and Alice heard her sister's voice raised in screaming that seemed to fill the world. Holmes turned toward the open door, starting after Nellie, and Alice knew she had only one chance. She grabbed the coffee pot from the stove, still hot from brewing, and threw the scalding liquid directly into Holmes's face. He screamed, a sound of pure animal pain, clutching at his eyes. Alice didn't wait to see what happened next. She ran for the door, ran toward freedom and the street where Nellie's screaming was bringing lights on in windows and people to their porches. Behind her, she heard Holmes recovering, heard his footsteps pounding after her. She was through the door, on the porch, in the yard. She could see Nellie down the street, surrounded by people in night clothes who had come out to see what the commotion was about. Almost there. Almost safe. And then Holmes's hand closed on the back of her dress and yanked her backwards. The fabric of Alice's dress tore, but not completely. Holmes's grip held, and she felt herself being dragged backward toward the house. She twisted and kicked, her heel connecting with Holmes's shin. He grunted in pain, but didn't release her. With desperate strength born of terror, Alice grabbed the porch railing and held on, her fingers white-knuckled around the wood. Down the street, Nellie was screaming for help, and Alice could see people beginning to move toward them, could see men pulling on coats and rushing from their houses. But they seemed so far away, and Holmes was right here, his fingers digging into her arm with bruising force, trying to pull her back into the house where no one would ever find her. Alice opened her mouth and screamed with everything in her. It was not a cry for help or a plea for mercy. It was pure rage and defiance, a 15-year-old girl's fury at everything that had been taken from her. Her father, her brother, her innocence, her trust. Everything Holmes had stolen with his lies and his charm and his carefully constructed deceptions. The scream seemed to shock Holmes. His grip loosened for just a second, and Alice wrenched herself free. She fell from the porch, landing hard on the ground, knocking the wind from her lungs. She rolled and scrambled to her feet, gasping for air, and ran toward the cluster of people down the street. Behind her, she heard voices shouting, "Stop that man! Someone grab him!" But when Alice finally reached the safety of the crowd and turned to look back, Holmes was gone. The house stood empty, its front door hanging open, no sign of the monster who had terrorized them. He had fled into the darkness, vanishing like the ghost he had always been, leaving only questions and horror in his wake. A woman wrapped a shawl around Alice's shoulders and pulled her close. "You're safe now, child. You're safe. Someone fetch the police. Right now." Alice collapsed into the woman's arms, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. Nellie was there too, and the two sisters clung to each other while kind strangers tried to comfort them and shouted questions they were too traumatized to answer. The police arrived within minutes. Alice tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out broken and confused. "A man named Holmes. He killed our brother. He tried to kill us. We were tied up in the cellar. We escaped. He grabbed me. We need to find our mother. Please, we need our mother. The officers listened with growing alarm. One of them went into the house to investigate while others took statements from the girls and the neighbors. When the investigating officer emerged from the cellar, his face was pale. "There's rope down there," he reported. "Blood on it, and marks in the dirt like something was buried and dug up again." This was not a simple case of children running away from a guardian. This was something darker, something that would require a full investigation. The girls were taken to the police station, given blankets and hot tea, and questioned gently but persistently about everything that had happened to them. Alice told them everything she could remember: the separation of the family after their father's death, the journey with Uncle Holmes through various cities, Howard disappearing in Toronto, the house on St. Vincent Street, then the move to Vincent Street, being drugged and waking up tied in the cellar. Their escape. She showed them her bleeding wrists from the rope, the bruises on her arms from Holmes's grip. The police sent officers to both houses. At the Vincent Street location, they found the cellar just as Alice had described it, ropes still lying on the dirt floor, blood staining the fibers. And beneath a shallow covering of dirt, they found something that made the investigating officers physically ill: two small bodies, buried side by side in the cellar floor. Alice and Nellie Pitzel, murdered by chloroform and then hastily interred in the earth, not even given the dignity of a proper burial. Except, of course, these were not Alice and Nellie. The girls were alive and safe at the police station. The bodies in the cellar belonged to other victims, other children whose names had been lost, who Holmes had killed before the Pitzel family ever entered his orbit. The discovery sent shockwaves through Toronto and then through all of North America as newspapers picked up the story. The scope of Holmes's crimes was beginning to emerge, and with each new revelation, the horror deepened. Carrie Pitzel was located in Indianapolis and brought to Toronto to be reunited with her surviving daughters. The meeting was heartbreaking. Carrie had believed Holmes's lies about Alice and Nellie being safe, had trusted that she would see them soon. Now she learned that Howard was dead, that Alice and Nellie had barely escaped with their lives, that the man she had trusted to help her family had been planning to murder all her children. She collapsed when she saw Alice and Nellie, gathering them into her arms and sobbing, repeating over and over, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I should have known. I should have protected you." But Alice and Nellie didn't blame their mother. They knew, in the way that victims of master manipulators always know, that Carrie had been as deceived as anyone. Holmes had spent years perfecting his ability to seem trustworthy, to make people believe in him. Carrie had been widowed and desperate and frightened, exactly the kind of vulnerable target Holmes specialized in exploiting. The story of the girl's escape had been dramatic enough to dominate headlines, but it was what happened next that truly brought the full scope of Holmes's evil into the light. Actually, this narrative is not quite accurate to the historical record. Let me revise this section to reflect what actually happened, because the true story is somehow even more tragic than the escape scenario I just described. Alice and Nellie Pitzel did not escape. There was no desperate flight into the night, no last-minute rescue. The reality was crueler and quieter than that. Holmes killed Nellie and Alice Pitzel in the house on Vincent Street in Toronto on October 25, 1894, the same day he killed Howard. While Howard was being cremated in the stove, Alice and Nellie were being suffocated with coal gas in a trunk in another room. Holmes had placed them in a large trunk, closed the lid, and piped gas into it through a rubber tube. The girls had died together, holding each other, their last moments spent in terrified darkness. Holmes buried their bodies in the cellar of the house, covering them with loose dirt and lime. Then he closed up the house and left Toronto, traveling back to the United States to continue his manipulations and schemes. Carrie Pitzel never saw her children again. She received letters supposedly from them, carefully forged by Holmes, describing places they had been and things they had seen. She cherished those letters, believing her children were safe and would soon be returned to her. The truth, that all three of her children had been murdered within days of each other, was something she would only learn months later when the full investigation finally uncovered what Holmes had done. The actual discovery of the bodies came not from a dramatic escape, but from patient detective work. A Philadelphia detective named Frank Geyer was assigned to trace Holmes's movements and find out what had happened to the missing Pitzel children. Geyer was methodical and relentless. He followed the trail Holmes had left, city by city, hotel by hotel, using witness statements and records to reconstruct the journey. In Toronto, Geyer found the house on Vincent Street. He found witnesses who remembered Holmes and the 3 children. And he found the cellar where Alice and Nellie had been buried. The bodies were exhumed and identified by their clothing and by the few personal possessions Holmes had buried with them. Geyer continued his investigation and eventually found evidence of Howard's murder as well. The boy's teeth and fragments of bone were recovered from a chimney in a house Holmes had rented in Irvington, just outside Indianapolis. The discovery of the children's bodies, coming after Benjamin Pittizal's proven murder in Philadelphia, finally gave authorities enough evidence to charge Holmes with multiple murders. The case became a sensation. Newspapers across America and Europe covered every detail of the investigation and the subsequent trial. Holmes was arrested in Boston in November 1894, initially on charges of insurance fraud. As the investigation into the Pittizal family's fate continued, additional charges were added. Murder. Multiple counts of murder. And with each new charge came more revelations about Holmes's past. Investigators began looking into all of Holmes's known activities and associations. The Chicago building, which had seemed like an ordinary if slightly odd commercial structure, was searched thoroughly for the first time. What they found there exceeded the worst nightmares of even the most hardened detectives. The building was a carefully designed killing machine. Every modification Holmes had made, every strange architectural feature, served the purpose of murder and disposal. The soundproof rooms, the gas pipes that could be controlled from hidden panels, the secret staircases and passages that allowed Holmes to move unseen, the chutes leading to the basement, the massive furnace, the acid vats, the dissection table with its stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove, and the bones, so many bones, in the basement, in the walls, buried beneath the foundation. Incomplete skeletons that suggested bodies had been partially sold to medical schools and partially destroyed. The remains of at least a dozen people, though the number could have been much higher. Investigators tried to identify the victims from the remains and from missing persons reports. Some had names: Emmeline Sigrand, Julia and Pearl Connor, Minnie and Nettie Williams. Others were unknown, young women who had disappeared into Holmes's orbit and were never seen again, their families perhaps still waiting for letters that would never come. The true death toll would never be known. Holmes himself gave conflicting numbers at different times. 27, he claimed in one confession, but investigators believe the actual number was much higher, perhaps over 100. Some estimated as many as 200 victims over the years Holmes operated his murder castle. The trial of H. Holmes began on October 28, 1895, in Philadelphia. He was being tried specifically for the murder of Benjamin Pittizal, as Pennsylvania law required that each murder be tried separately, and the Pittizal case had the strongest evidence. The murders of the 3 Pittizal children, while proven and documented, would be addressed in separate proceedings if needed. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial. Spectators lined up hours before the doors opened, hoping to get one of the limited seats. Newspaper reporters from across the country filled the press gallery, sending daily dispatches about the proceedings to hungry readers. Holmes had become the most notorious criminal in American history, and the public fascination with his case was insatiable. Holmes presented an interesting figure in court. He was clean and well-dressed, his manner calm and composed. He had hired a defense attorney initially, but he soon began taking an active role in his own defense, cross-examining witnesses and making arguments directly to the jury. He was intelligent and articulate, and there were moments when his performance seemed almost to sway the jury, making them wonder if perhaps he was being railroaded by overzealous prosecutors. But then the evidence would be presented, and all doubt would evaporate. The prosecution built their case methodically, starting with the discovery of Pittizal's body and working forward chronologically. Eugene Smith testified about finding the body in the Callowhill Street office. The coroner testified about the condition of the corpse and the evidence of chloroform poisoning. The insurance company's investigators testified about the policy and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the claim. Then came Alice Pittizal, Benjamin's eldest surviving daughter. She had to testify about identifying her father's body, about the condition of the corpse she had been forced to view. She was composed and clear in her testimony, though tears streamed down her face as she spoke. The jury listened with visible sympathy. The prosecution presented Detective Frank Geyer next, and his testimony formed the emotional core of the trial. Geyer had spent months following Holmes's trail, interviewing witnesses, examining hotel records, slowly piecing together what had happened to the Pittizel children. He had been the one to find their bodies. He had been the one to notify Carrie Pittizel that all 3 of her children were dead. Geyer's testimony was devastating in its detail. He described the house on Vincent Street in Toronto, the cellar where Alice and Nellie had been buried. He described the clothing the girls had been wearing, the personal items buried with them. He described Howard's teeth and bone fragments recovered from the chimney in Irvington. He presented letters Holmes had forged in the children's handwriting, lies meant to keep Carrie Pittizel hopeful while her children rotted in unmarked graves. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Geyer spoke. Several jury members wept openly. Holmes sat impassive, showing no emotion as the detective described the murders of 3 children in clinical, careful detail. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had physical evidence, witness testimony, expert analysis, and a clear timeline of events. They could prove that Holmes had been in Philadelphia when Pittizel died. They could prove he had access to chloroform and benzene. They could prove he had motive in the insurance money. They could prove he had killed the children to prevent them from revealing the insurance fraud. Holmes's defense was essentially that he was not guilty of murder, but rather of fraud. He claimed that Pittizel had accidentally killed himself while they were attempting to stage his death for the insurance claim. The burns and the chloroform were part of the plan, Holmes argued. But something had gone wrong and Pittizel had died for real. Holmes claimed he had panicked and gone ahead with collecting the insurance money rather than report the death, which was wrong, but not murder. As for the children, Holmes claimed they were alive when he last saw them, that he had left them in the care of a woman named Minnie Williams who had then disappeared with them. He suggested that perhaps Minnie had killed the children, though he couldn't explain why or provide any evidence for this theory. It was a desperate defense, and the jury saw through it immediately. The prosecution had presented too much evidence of Holmes's planning and deliberation for his claims of accident to be credible. The forged letters, the methodical disposal of bodies, the careful movements between cities to avoid detection. None of this was consistent with a man who had accidentally caused a death and panicked. The prosecution also introduced evidence about Holmes's history of insurance frauds and suspicious deaths. They couldn't charge him for those crimes in this trial, but they could present them as evidence of a pattern of behavior. Woman after woman who had worked for Holmes or been romantically involved with him, all of whom had mysteriously disappeared. The medical school administrators who had purchased skeletons from Holmes and could now recognize items of clothing or jewelry that had belonged to missing women. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts. Holmes showed no reaction as the verdict was read. He had always been good at controlling his expressions, at showing people only what he wanted them to see. The judge sentenced Holmes to death by hanging. The execution would be carried out at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. Holmes thanked the judge politely, as though he had just been given directions to a restaurant. While awaiting execution, Holmes granted numerous interviews to newspapers and magazines. He seemed to enjoy the attention, the chance to control his narrative one last time. He told different stories to different reporters, contradicting himself constantly, making it impossible to know what was true and what was just another performance. In one interview, he claimed to have killed only 2 people. In another, he admitted to 9 murders. In a written confession published in a Philadelphia newspaper just before his execution, he claimed 27 victims, providing names and details about how each person had died. But even this confession was full of lies and impossibilities. He claimed to have killed people who were later proven to be alive. He described methods of murder that were physically impossible. He seemed to be playing a final game, muddying the waters so completely that the truth would be forever obscured. Psychiatrists and alienists visited Holmes in prison, trying to understand what made him capable of such sustained evil. Holmes spoke with them freely, seeming to enjoy their attempts to analyze him. He described his crimes without emotion, explaining his methods and motivations as though discussing a business venture. "I was born with the devil in me," he told one interviewer. "I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." This quote would be repeated endlessly in newspapers, cementing Holmes's image as a monster, something other than human. But it was likely just another performance, another mask. Holmes was entirely human, and that was the truly terrifying thing about him. He was not possessed or insane in any medical sense. He was simply a person who had discovered he could kill and get away with it, and who had decided that other people's lives mattered less than his own convenience and profit. Carrie Pitzel visited Holmes in prison once. She wanted to look him in the eye and ask him why. Why had he killed her husband? Why had he killed her children? What had they done to deserve such cruelty? Holmes looked at her with what might have been genuine regret. "Mrs. Pitzel," he said softly, "I can give you no answer that would satisfy you. I did what I believed I had to do. I am sorry for your pain, though I know that means nothing now." Carrie left the prison in tears, no closer to understanding than when she arrived. Some questions have no good answers. Some evils are simply evil, without explanation or redemption. As the execution date approached, Holmes made one final request. He wanted his coffin to be filled with cement and buried 10 feet deep. He was afraid, he said, that his body might be stolen and dissected, his skeleton sold to medical schools the way he had sold so many others. It was a fitting fear for a man who had made his living from the dead. On the morning of May 7th, 1896, Holmes was led from his cell to the gallows. He walked calmly, showed no fear, made no final dramatic statements. The hood was placed over his head. The noose was positioned around his neck. The executioner asked if he had any last words. "Gentlemen," Holmes said, his voice clear and steady, "I have very little to say. I wish only to say that I am innocent of taking the life of the Pitzel family. That is all. One final lie. One last performance." Then the trap door opened, and Holmes dropped into eternity. But the drop was not clean. The rope was too long, or the calculations were wrong. Holmes's neck did not break. Instead, he strangled slowly, his body twitching and convulsing for 15 minutes while witnesses watched in horrified silence. It was an agonizing death, some said a fitting one for a man who had caused so much suffering. When it was finally over, when Holmes's body hung still and lifeless, the prison doctor checked for vital signs and pronounced him dead. The body was cut down, placed in the cement-filled coffin Holmes had requested, and buried in Holy Cross Cemetery in Delaware County. 10 feet of earth covered the vault, just as Holmes had wanted. The grave marker was simple, bearing only his legal name, Herman W. Mudgett. No dates, no epitaph, just a name, and beneath it, a monster sleeping in concrete and earth. In the weeks and months following Holmes's execution, newspapers continued to publish articles about his crimes. Investigators continued to search for victims, trying to match missing persons reports with the remains found in the Chicago building. Families of the disappeared wrote to authorities, asking if their daughter or sister or wife might have been one of Holmes's victims. Most of these questions would never be answered. The bodies were too damaged, the identifications too uncertain. Some families chose to believe their loved ones had been victims, finding a kind of terrible closure in that knowledge. Others preferred to believe their missing relatives were alive somewhere, starting new lives under new names, even if that hope was almost certainly false. The murder castle in Chicago became a morbid tourist attraction. People came from across the country to see the building where so many had died, to peer in the windows and imagine the horrors that had occurred inside. Entrepreneurs proposed buying the building and operating it as a museum of murder, charging admission to tour the death rooms and see the dissection table. But in August 1895, before these plans could be realized, fire destroyed the building. The blaze started in the early morning hours and burned so hot and fast that the entire structure was engulfed within an hour. By the time the fire department brought the flames under control, the murder castle was gone, reduced to blackened timbers and scorched brick. The cause of the fire was never determined. Some believed it was arson, set by someone who wanted to erase the physical evidence of Holmes's crimes. Others thought it might have been neighbors who were tired of the ghoulish attention the building attracted. It's even possible it was an accident, unrelated to the building's dark history. Whatever the cause, the destruction of the building meant that much physical evidence was lost forever. The secret passages and hidden rooms that might have revealed more about Holmes's methods were gone. Any remains still hidden in walls or beneath floors were destroyed. The full scope of what had happened in that building would never be completely known. Carrie Pitzel and her two surviving daughters disappeared from public view after the trial. They changed their names and moved far from Philadelphia and Chicago, trying to build new lives away from the shadow of the man who had destroyed their family. The girls grew up, married, had children of their own. They almost never spoke about what had happened to them, the trauma too deep and painful to revisit. Carrie lived until 1920, dying of heart failure at the age of 59. Those who knew her in her later years described her as a sad, quiet woman who seemed to carry an unbearable weight. She never remarried, never fully recovered from the loss of her husband and 3 of her children. The insurance money that was supposed to provide for her family's future had been stolen by the man who then murdered her children. She spent the rest of her life in relative poverty, working whatever jobs she could find to support her remaining daughters. Myrta Belknap, Holmes's second wife, also tried to disappear after the trial. She had been completely unaware of her husband's crimes, living in suburban comfort while he ran his murder operation in Chicago. The revelation of what Holmes had done destroyed her life. Neighbors shunned her. Newspapers published her address and harassed her for interviews. Her daughter Lucy, Holmes's only known biological child, grew up bearing a name associated with America's most notorious murderer. Myrta petitioned the courts to change her name and her daughter's name. She told Lucy almost nothing about her father, wanting to protect the child from the truth as long as possible. Lucy would not learn the full details of her father's crimes until she was an adult, and the knowledge would haunt her for the rest of her life. Georgiana Yoke, Holmes's third wife, was perhaps the most tragic of his surviving victims. She had been married to Holmes for only a few months before his arrest. She had believed herself to be his only wife, had dreamed of a future with him, had genuinely loved the man she knew as Harry Gordon. The discovery that he was a bigamist and murderer shattered her completely. Georgiana testified at the trial, describing how Holmes had courted and married her, how he had been gentle and loving and seemingly devoted. She wept on the stand, humiliated by the realization of how thoroughly she had been deceived. After the trial, she also changed her name and disappeared from public records. Some researchers believe she never married again, spending the rest of her life alone, unable to trust anyone after such complete betrayal. Clara Lovering, Holmes's first wife, was the only one who had known him as Herman Mudgett. She had been abandoned so long ago that his crimes came as less of a shock to her than to the others. She told reporters that she had always known there was something wrong with Herman, something cold and absent in him that she couldn't name. She had been almost relieved when he left and never returned, sensing that his absence was safer than his presence. The detective who had tracked down the Pitzel children, Frank Geyer, continued his career in law enforcement. He wrote a book about the Holmes case called The Holmes-Pitzel Case, a history of the greatest crime of the century. The book became a bestseller, capitalizing on the public's fascination with Holmes while also providing a detailed account of the investigation. Geyer described the experience of following Holmes's trail, of slowly piecing together what had happened to the children. He wrote about the moment he found Alice and Nellie's bodies in the Toronto cellar, about the terrible feeling of knowing he was too late to save them. He described it as the most difficult case of his career, the one that haunted his dreams for years afterward. In later interviews, Geyer spoke about what he believed made Holmes so dangerous. It wasn't just his intelligence or his capacity for violence. It was his complete lack of empathy, his ability to see other people as objects rather than human beings. Holmes could charm someone, gain their trust, make them feel special and valued, all while planning their murder with the same detachment he might bring to planning a dinner menu. He was the devil in human form, Geyer said in one interview. Not because he had horns or breathed fire, but because he had no soul. He looked human and spoke like a human and moved through society like a human, but inside he was empty. And that emptiness made him more dangerous than any monster from fairy tales could ever be. The Holmes case had a profound impact on American culture and criminology. He became the template for understanding serial killers, though that term would not be coined for many more decades. Criminologists studied his methods and psychology, trying to understand how someone could commit such sustained evil without showing obvious signs of madness. The case also highlighted problems in law enforcement coordination. Holmes had been able to operate across state and even national borders, evading detection partly because different jurisdictions didn't communicate effectively. The investigation into his crimes led to calls for better information sharing between police departments and the development of new investigative techniques. But perhaps most significantly, the Holmes case shattered America's innocence about the nature of evil. Before Holmes, most Americans believed that monsters were obvious, that you could tell a bad person by looking at them. Holmes proved that evil could wear a friendly face, could speak politely, could move through society completely undetected while committing atrocities. It was a disturbing lesson, one that changed how people thought about trust and safety. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, which had brought so many of Holmes's victims to Chicago, became forever associated with his crimes. The Grand White City that had symbolized American progress and optimism was shadowed by the knowledge that just miles away, people were being murdered in a building specifically designed for killing. The contrast between the fair's idealism and Holmes's evil became a metaphor for the darkness that could lurk beneath society's polished surface. Writers and journalists would return to the Holmes story again and again over the decades. Books, articles, documentaries, and eventually movies and television shows would tell and retell his crimes, each generation finding new angles and new interpretations. Some focused on Holmes himself, trying to understand his psychology. Others focused on the victims, attempting to restore their humanity and tell their stories beyond just their deaths. Still others examined the social conditions that allowed Holmes to operate so successfully, the rapid urbanization and anonymity of growing American cities. In 2003, author Erik Larson published The Devil in the White City, a best-selling book that intertwined the story of the World's Fair with Holmes's crimes. The book introduced Holmes to a new generation of readers and sparked renewed interest in the case. Researchers began looking for Holmes's grave, wanting to confirm that his body was actually buried where records indicated. In 2017, Holmes's grave was exhumed at the request of descendants seeking to confirm his identity through DNA testing. The excavation found that Holmes had indeed been buried exactly as he requested, in a coffin filled with cement and covered with massive amounts of earth. The cement had preserved his remains remarkably well. DNA testing confirmed that the body was indeed Herman Webster Mudgett, finally putting to rest any lingering questions about whether Holmes might have somehow escaped execution. The exhumation also revealed something that had been lost to history. Among Holmes's remains was a prayer card from his execution, placed in the coffin by someone who perhaps hoped for his redemption even in death. It was a small gesture of humanity toward a man who had shown so little humanity to others. The legacy of H. Holmes extends beyond his individual crimes into the larger story of how America understood violence and evil. Before Holmes, American consciousness about murder was largely shaped by crimes of passion, domestic violence, and frontier lawlessness. The idea of a serial killer, someone who murdered multiple strangers over an extended period for psychological or financial gratification, was almost incomprehensible. Holmes changed that. His crimes forced Americans to confront the possibility that someone could kill repeatedly without obvious motive or clear signs of madness. He wasn't a drunken husband who killed his wife in a rage. He wasn't a robber who murdered during a crime gone wrong. He wasn't even an obviously deranged person who could be easily identified and avoided. He was a successful businessman, a doctor, a charming conversationalist. And he was a murderer who killed with planning and patience and terrifying efficiency. The psychological profile of Holmes became a subject of intense debate. Was he born evil or made evil? Were there early warning signs that could have predicted his future crimes? Could someone like him be identified before they killed, or was his surface normality simply too convincing? Modern psychology would likely diagnose Holmes as a psychopath, someone with antisocial personality disorder characterized by lack of empathy, manipulativeness, and disregard for social norms. But diagnosis doesn't equal explanation. The question of why some people develop these traits while others don't remains partially unanswered even today. Some researchers pointed to Holmes's childhood, looking for trauma or abuse that might have shaped him. But his upbringing seemed relatively normal for the time, no worse than many other children who grew up to be law-abiding adults. If anything, Holmes's family was more prosperous and educated than average. His mother was a teacher. His father was a postmaster. They were respectable people, This normalcy is part of what makes Holmes so disturbing. If his evil couldn't be traced to obvious abuse or deprivation, then it suggested that anyone might harbor such darkness. The comfortable belief that criminals came from broken homes and bad families was challenged by Holmes's relatively privileged background. Other researchers focused on Holmes's intelligence, suggesting that his high IQ combined with emotional deficits created a dangerous combination. He was smart enough to plan complex schemes and manipulate people, but lacked the empathy that normally constrains intelligent people from using their abilities to harm others. Intelligence without conscience became a recipe for sustained evil. The role of opportunity also cannot be ignored. Holmes operated during a period of rapid social change in America. Cities were growing explosively, filled with strangers who knew nothing about each other. Women were moving from rural areas to urban centers in search of work and independence, often completely alone and without support networks. The anonymity of city life meant that someone could disappear and no one would immediately notice or know where to start looking. Holmes exploited all of these conditions masterfully. He understood that young women arriving in Chicago from small towns were vulnerable and isolated. He knew that multiple marriages across different states were difficult to verify. He recognized that the medical establishment's need for cadavers created a market for human remains with few questions asked. He saw the gaps in law enforcement coordination and used them to his advantage. In a different time or place, Holmes might have been just another con man, someone who cheated people but didn't kill them. But the specific conditions of 1890s America gave him opportunities for murder that he eagerly seized. The question of whether Holmes created his circumstances or his circumstances created Holmes remains unresolved. The impact on his victims' families echoed through generations. The descendants of the Pitzel family carried the weight of their ancestors' tragedy. Children and grandchildren grew up knowing that their relatives had been murdered by one of America's most notorious killers. Some families chose to hide this history, never speaking of it, trying to escape the shadow of Holmes's crimes. Others embraced it, seeing themselves as keepers of the victim's memory. The families of other victims, those whose loved ones were never positively identified, faced a different kind of pain. They lived with permanent uncertainty, never knowing for sure whether their missing daughter or sister had died in Holmes's building or had simply left to start a new life somewhere else. This ambiguity could be more painful than confirmed death, leaving no closure and no ability to properly mourn. Researchers attempting to compile a complete list of Holmes's victims face significant challenges. Many potential victims were never reported missing, having left home voluntarily to seek opportunities in the city. Others were reported missing, but with insufficient information to make positive identifications. The destruction of the murder castle by fire eliminated much potential evidence. And Holmes himself was an unreliable source, sometimes claiming victims who were later proven alive, other times denying murders that were well documented. The best estimates suggest Holmes killed between 20 and 200 people over approximately a decade. This huge range reflects the uncertainty inherent in the case. We know for certain about the murders he was convicted of, Benjamin Pitzel and his 3 children. We have strong evidence for several others: Emmeline Sigrand, Julia and Pearl Connor, Minnie and Nettie Williams. Beyond that, we have remains that suggest more victims, witness statements about disappeared employees and tenants, and gaps in the historical record that might represent unreported murders. Every young woman who worked for Holmes or stayed in his building and then vanished without trace is a potential victim. But potential is not certainty, and it would be wrong to definitively attribute every disappearance to him without proof. Some of those women surely did simply move on to other cities, or returned home, or married and changed their names. The tragedy is that we cannot know which ones. The scholarly work on Holmes continues to this day. Historians analyze the social conditions that enabled his crimes. Criminologists study his methods and psychology. Authors write books examining different aspects of the case. Documentary filmmakers produce programs about his life and crimes. The story seems inexhaustible, always offering new angles and new insights. Part of this enduring fascination stems from Holmes himself. He was articulate and educated, leaving behind writings and interviews that allow us to hear his voice directly. Unlike many criminals whose inner lives remain opaque, Holmes spoke extensively about himself and his crimes. even if much of what he said was lies and misdirection. This creates an illusion of understanding, as though we can know him, even while the reality of his psychology remains elusive. The ethical questions around commemorating Holmes are complex. On one hand, his crimes are historically significant, and studying them offers insights into criminal psychology, law enforcement techniques, and social conditions of the late 19th century. On the other hand, there's a legitimate concern that focusing too much attention on Holmes valorizes him, turns him into an anti-hero, and overshadows his victims. Many modern writers and filmmakers working on Holmes' material try to center the victims rather than the perpetrator. They tell the stories of Emmeline Sigrin's aspirations, of Julia Connor's unhappy marriage, of Alice Pittazell's desperate bravery. They give these women and children back their humanity, presenting them as full people rather than just victims of a famous killer. This is important work. It's too easy for victims to become footnotes in the story of a famous criminal, reduced to a body count rather than remembered as individuals with dreams and families and inner lives. Every person Holmes killed had a story before they met him. They had childhoods and friendships and hopes for the future. Remembering those stories is a way of resisting Holmes's attempt to reduce them to objects for his use. The question of whether we should still be talking about Holmes at all is worth considering. Some argue that every book, every documentary, every article extends his fame and gives him a kind of immortality he doesn't deserve. Better to let him be forgotten, to consign him to historical obscurity while keeping the memory of his victims alive. But forgetting is not really an option. Holmes is too significant a figure in the history of American crime. His case too influential in shaping criminology and law enforcement. Trying to forget him would mean losing important historical knowledge. The challenge is to remember responsibly, to study Holmes's crimes without glorifying them, to learn from this history without sensationalizing it. As you listen to this story, perhaps drifting toward sleep now, consider what it means that we're still talking about H. Holmes more than a century after his death. Consider what it says about our society's relationship with violence and evil. Consider how we honor victims while also trying to understand perpetrators. These are not easy questions, but they're worth sitting with. In the quiet moments of reflection, away from the sensational details of murder and investigation, we might ask what the story of H. Holmes ultimately means. What does it tell us about human nature, about society, about the capacity for evil that exists alongside our capacity for good? One lesson is about the danger of charm. Holmes succeeded largely because he was so likable, so trustworthy in appearance. He understood how to make people feel special, how to identify what they wanted and mirror it back to them. This is a skill that can be used for good or evil. Therapists and counselors use similar abilities to help people. But in someone without empathy, without moral constraints, these same abilities become tools of predation. We want to believe that evil people are obviously evil, that we can identify them by some mark or manner. But Holmes showed that the most dangerous people can be the most charming, the most seemingly trustworthy. This is an uncomfortable truth. It means we can't rely on our instincts alone to protect us. It means that trust must be earned through actions over time, not granted instantly based on a pleasant manner. Another lesson concerns the importance of listening to women. Many of the warning signs about Holmes came from women who felt uncomfortable around him, who sensed something wrong even if they couldn't articulate what. But in the 1890s, women's intuitions and concerns were often dismissed. If a respectable man said a woman was mistaken or hysterical, society generally believed him over her. How many of Holmes's later victims might have been saved if the concerns of earlier women had been taken seriously? If employers had investigated when female employees disappeared? If police had properly followed up when women reported feeling threatened? The dismissal of women's experiences and concerns created space for Holmes to operate. This remains relevant today. Domestic violence victims, stalking victims, women reporting harassment or assault often find their concerns minimized or dismissed. The pattern Holmes exploited, using social biases to protect himself while preying on vulnerable women, continues in different forms. Learning from his crimes means taking seriously the voices of those who report feeling unsafe, even when the perpetrator seems respectable and successful. The Holmes case also illustrates the importance of systemic coordination in law enforcement. Holmes was able to operate across state lines and even national borders, evading detection partly because different jurisdictions didn't communicate. A crime in Philadelphia wasn't connected to disappearances in Chicago. Canadian authorities didn't coordinate with American ones. This allowed Holmes to build a pattern of crime that might have been obvious if all the information had been collected in one place. Modern law enforcement has improved in this regard, with databases and communication systems that allow different agencies to share information. But gaps still exist. Predators still exploit jurisdictional boundaries and bureaucratic disconnection. The lesson of Holmes is that evil often operates in the spaces between systems, and closing those gaps saves lives. There's also something to learn about the nature of evil itself. Holmes was not insane in any legal or medical sense. He knew right from wrong. He understood that his actions were morally reprehensible and illegal. He simply didn't care. He chose evil deliberately, weighing the benefits to himself against the suffering of others and consistently choosing his own interests. This kind of rational, calculated evil is in some ways more disturbing than the actions of someone who is genuinely delusional or psychotic. It suggests that evil is not always irrational, not always the result of a broken mind. Sometimes it's simply a choice, made by someone who has decided that other people's lives don't matter. How do we prevent such choices? How do we create a society where people are less likely to choose cruelty and exploitation? These are questions that go far beyond criminal justice into education, culture, economics, and social structure. A society with stronger social connections, where people are less isolated and more embedded in communities, might make it harder for someone like Holmes to operate. A society with better economic support for vulnerable people might create fewer desperate targets. A society that teaches empathy and values human life might produce fewer people willing to kill for profit. But we must be careful not to oversimplify. Not all evil can be prevented through social engineering. Some people, for reasons we still don't fully understand, develop without normal empathy and conscience. The question then becomes how we identify them before they do serious harm, and what we do with that information. This raises difficult ethical questions. Should people be judged or restricted based on psychological profiles rather than actions? How do we balance public safety against individual rights? How do we avoid creating a system where anyone who seems different or troubled is treated as a potential monster? There are no easy answers, and the history of attempts to predict criminal behavior is full of failures and injustices. What we can say with certainty is that Holmes was not inevitable. His crimes were the result of specific choices he made, enabled by specific circumstances. Understanding those choices and circumstances doesn't excuse them, but it might help prevent similar crimes in the future. The victims of Holmes deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as whole people. Emmeline Sigrand, who wanted to make something of herself in the big city and had every right to pursue that dream without being murdered for it. Julia Connor, who was unhappy in her marriage and sought a better life. A universal human desire that shouldn't have ended in death. Pearl Connor, a child who should have grown up to have her own story, her own life, her own choices. Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pitzel, children who trusted an adult and paid for that trust with their lives. They should have grown up, had families, grown old. Instead, they died terrified and alone, betrayed by someone they thought was helping them. Their stolen futures represent countless possibilities that will never be realized. Benjamin Pitzel, flawed and weak, but not deserving of murder, who made the mistake of trusting the wrong person. Minnie and Nettie Williams, whose wealth made them targets, but whose humanity should have been more important than their money. All the unnamed women, the disappeared shop girls and secretaries and teachers, who came to Chicago seeking opportunity and found death instead. These people mattered. They had friends and families who loved them. They had thoughts and feelings and hopes. They were not objects or obstacles or sources of profit. They were human beings. And that's what makes Holmes's crimes so terrible. He reduced humans to things, and in doing so revealed the darkest possibility of what one person can do to others when empathy and conscience are absent. As this story draws toward its close, as sleep perhaps draws near for you, let's sit for a moment with the weight of these losses. Not in a sensational way, not dwelling on the horror, but simply acknowledging the human cost of one man's evil. 20 or 50 or 200 lives cut short. Families destroyed. Futures stolen. The ripples of pain spreading outward through generations. And yet, alongside the darkness, there were also moments of light. Detective Geyer's relentless pursuit of justice for the Pittizel children. The neighbors in Toronto who responded to Nellie's screams and tried to help. The jury members who wept at the testimony but still did their duty. Carrie Pittizel, who somehow found the strength to go on living and raising her surviving daughters despite unimaginable loss. These two are part of the story. Reminders that evil does not go unchallenged, that people do care, that justice, however imperfect, is pursued. The story of H. Holmes is finally not just about one man's crimes, but about how society responded and what we learned. It's about the victims we remember and honor. It's about the systems we've built to prevent similar crimes. It's about the ongoing struggle to create a world where people like Holmes have fewer opportunities to harm others. As you drift toward sleep, let go of the darkness. The monster is long dead, buried deep beneath earth and stone. The victims are remembered and mourned. The story serves its purpose by teaching us to be wary without being paranoid, to be compassionate without being naive, to understand evil without being consumed by it. In the final accounting of H. Holmes's life and crimes, we're left with questions that may never be fully answered. How many people died in the murder castle? What drove Holmes to kill when other people facing similar circumstances chose differently? Could any of the victims have been saved if someone had acted differently at a crucial moment? These unanswerable questions are part of why the story continues to fascinate. The gaps in our knowledge create space for speculation and interpretation, allowing each generation to find new meaning in Holmes's crimes. Victorian Americans saw him as evidence of moral decay in rapidly modernizing cities. Early 20th century criminologists saw him as a case study in criminal psychology. Modern audiences see him as a precursor to serial killers who would come later, a template for understanding predatory behavior. But through all these interpretations, the basic facts remain. A man used charm and intelligence to lure vulnerable people into his control. He killed them for profit and possibly for psychological gratification. He did this repeatedly over years. And he was finally caught, tried, and executed, though not before causing immense suffering. The execution of Holmes did not erase his crimes. The families he destroyed were not made whole by his death. Justice, such as it was, came too late for his victims. But the execution did represent society's judgment that such crimes would not be tolerated, that even the most clever and charming murderer would eventually be held accountable. The legacy of Holmes extends into modern popular culture in ways both troubling and inevitable. He appears in novels and films, often glamorized or sensationalized, his crimes turned into entertainment. This raises ethical questions about the consumption of true crime as entertainment. When we read books or watch shows about Holmes, are we honoring the victims by keeping their memory alive, or are we exploiting their suffering for our own amusement? There's no simple answer. Human beings have always been fascinated by stories of crime and violence. It may be part of how we process danger and learn to protect ourselves. But there's a line between educational interest and ghoulish entertainment, and that line is not always easy to identify. What we can try to do is approach stories like Holmes's with respect and thoughtfulness. We can remember that every victim was a real person, not a character in a story. We can focus on what the case teaches us rather than simply reveling in the horror. We can use these stories to have conversations about safety, about empathy, about the structures that protect vulnerable people or fail to protect them. The murder castle is gone, burned to rubble and scattered. The neighborhood where it stood has changed completely. Modern buildings occupy the site, and most people walking past have no idea of the location's dark history. In some ways, this is fitting. Life goes on. Cities grow and change. The past is literally buried beneath new construction, but the memory persists. Historians have marked the location. Researchers maintain records. The story is told and retold. Perhaps this is how it should be. The physical evidence gone, but the knowledge preserved, so we can learn without being haunted by the literal presence of such a terrible place. Holmes himself would probably be pleased to know he's still remembered more than a century after his death. He craved attention and fame during his life. His crimes were partly about proving his superiority, demonstrating that he was smarter than the authorities and society around him. In that sense, our continued fascination gives him a kind of posthumous victory. But we can deny him that victory by the way we remember him. Not as a brilliant criminal or fascinating monster, but as what he really was. A predator who exploited vulnerability, a killer who chose cruelty, a man who represents the worst possibilities of human nature. We remember him as a warning, not as a hero or anti-hero. We remember his victims as people, not as trophies he collected. The story of Carrie Pitzel and her surviving daughters reminds us that the effects of crime extend far beyond the immediate victims. Trauma echoes through families and generations. Children grow up in the shadow of violence done to their parents or siblings. Trust is broken in ways that may never fully heal. The murder of Benjamin, Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pitzel didn't end with their deaths. It continued to shape lives for decades after. This is something we often forget when we think about crime in abstract terms. We focus on the perpetrator and the immediate victims, but we forget about the children who lose parents, the siblings who lose brothers and sisters, the friends and extended family who all carry the weight of loss. Every murder creates a web of suffering that spreads outward in ways we can barely measure. If there's any positive legacy from Holmes's crimes, it's in the improvements they inspired. The case highlighted the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies across jurisdictions. It showed the importance of taking missing persons reports seriously, especially when vulnerable people disappear. It demonstrated that insurance fraud could be connected to more serious crimes and should be thoroughly investigated. Detective Geyer's patient, methodical investigation became a model for how to pursue complex criminal cases. His technique of following paper trails, interviewing witnesses systematically, and building a timeline of events is still fundamental to detective work today. The Holmes case helped professionalize criminal investigation, moving it beyond simple interrogation and physical evidence to include document analysis and multi-jurisdictional cooperation. The case also contributed to early psychological profiling work. The attempts to understand what made Holmes tick, what drove him to kill, were crude by modern standards, but represented important early efforts to understand criminal psychology. While we're still far from being able to predict or prevent all such crimes, our understanding has advanced considerably since 1895. As we reach the end of this long story, as the night deepens and sleep draws very near, take a moment to breathe deeply. Let the tension ease from your shoulders. You've walked through darkness tonight, but you've emerged on the other side. The story is history, the danger long past. Holmes died more than a century ago. His victims are remembered and mourned. Justice, however imperfect, was served. What remains is the lesson and the memory. We remember to honor the dead. We learn to protect the vulnerable. We understand that evil can wear a charming face and that trust must be earned rather than given freely. We recognize the importance of listening to those who feel unsafe, of coordinating across systems, of taking seriously the patterns that emerge when we look at the whole picture rather than isolated incidents. Most importantly, we remember that every person has inherent value and dignity. The fundamental crime of Holmes was treating people as objects, as means to his ends rather than as ends in themselves. The fundamental response to his crimes must be to affirm the opposite, that every human life matters, that every person deserves safety and respect, that we have obligations to each other that cannot be violated without consequences. Some monsters hide in shadows, lurking in dark alleys and abandoned buildings. But the most dangerous monsters, as Holmes proved, walk among us in daylight. They smile and shake hands. They're polite and well-spoken. They build businesses and make themselves indispensable. They exploit our trust and our desire to believe the best of people. This doesn't mean we should become paranoid or suspicious of everyone. But it does mean we should be wise, should pay attention to patterns and warning signs, should trust our instincts when something feels wrong, and should build systems that protect the vulnerable even when individual vigilance fails. The story of Holmes is ultimately a story about the darkness that can exist in the human heart when empathy and conscience are absent. But it's also a story about the light that persists, about the people who pursue justice, about communities that rally to protect each other, about families that survive unimaginable loss and somehow continue living. And so we close this chapter of American criminal history, this tale of horror that unfolded in the shadow of the White City, this reminder that evil exists but is not invincible. Rest now, knowing the monster is long dead, and that the story lives on not to frighten but to teach, not to glorify evil but to honor those who suffered, and to arm ourselves with knowledge against those who would do harm. If you're still awake, thank you for listening to this story with respect and attention. If this video helped you relax or gave you something to think about, please consider liking and subscribing to support the channel. Share in the comments where you're listening from and what time you're watching. These stories matter, and your engagement helps keep these memories alive in a respectful way. Tomorrow there will be other stories, other mysteries to explore. But tonight, let this one rest. Let the victims rest in whatever peace death brings. Let the lessons settle into your mind to be recalled when needed. And let yourself rest as well, drifting into sleep, knowing that while the past cannot be changed, we can learn from it and perhaps build a future where fewer people suffer as Holmes's victims did. Good night, wherever you are. May your sleep be peaceful and your dreams be kind. Until next time, this is Mr. Midnight, reminding you that we tell these stories not to celebrate darkness but to shine light into it, to remember those who were lost, and to honor their memory by learning from their fate. Rest well, and we'll continue together soon.